Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Hello, darlings. Tomorrow is St. Patrick's Day, and as such, in honor of the Irish, I've gathered 9 stories that I have told about the Fae in the past. Of course, I have modern ones going on with the camping series and with the urban Fae, as well as the whole series of collected tales. But these are just a few here and there that I really liked. You probably haven't seen them. They go back a few years, so enjoy. And stay safe out there, my darlings. Call an Uber if you get drunk, please. Hello, my darlings. Madam Raven here, with a wonderful fairy tale for you. Again by the very talented Gilfwyn. It was going to be worth it, he thought, as he pushed yet another damn branch out of the way. Virgin forest would be part of the selling point, but at the moment he would give anything for a nice, level sidewalk. Another root wrapped around his ankle and threatened to send him face first into another pile of saber-toothed vines. He was doing everyone a favor getting this mess tamed. The river moved lazily past. There, just opposite that willow grove, would be the first deck overlook. Piers out into the bend would allow him to offer the lure of fishing and luxury. Now, over there, a boathouse. Canoes, floats. Now, over there, a boathouse, canoes, floats. People, for some reason, loved playing in filthy rivers. Up there, a proper pool and some discreet hot tubs for newlyweds to giggle in. But not so discreet that they need to sanitize the hot tubs hourly. The slope would be for the resort, river views, valley views, mountain views. Something for everyone. Tame the jungle, put in gardens, terraces. He was certain that it could become a wedding destination with the right sales team behind it. Hey, getting out into nature was the latest trend. But wanting to do it with the least amount of inconvenience was a given when dealing with the crowd he wanted to reach. Rich and spoiled. What was it they called it? Glamping? A flutter of cloth caught his eye. There among the curtain of the branches moved a woman in a dress, the exact color of the leaves. One eyebrow cocked upward as he tried to imagine just exactly how a woman in a dress had managed the hellish climb through the forest to get to the willows. Had to be a decent path over there. He stared in annoyance at the river that barred his path. The bridge was back at the highway. By the time he walked down and then back up, it would be nearly nightfall and the girl would be gone. He watched as she turned and went back into hiding among the willow leaves. Long, palest gold hair that caught for a moment on the branches and then trailed away. He wondered what she looked like. Tomorrow he would walk up that side of the river. Perhaps he could find whatever trail she'd used. Had to be much nicer than walking in the damn woods. He cursed again as pine cones dropped onto his head. Somewhere above the branches shifted and moved. Tree rats. Another annoyance he'd be glad to see run off. Hunting. That could be marketed. Shoot it, we cook it. He glanced one last time at the willow grove. Who was she? There was no trail he could find. Just another hike through things that tore at him, tripped him, and slapped him in the face. He found himself in the small clearing that surrounded the willow grove and nodded. Here were some large boulders, almost in a circle. Somewhat flat area. Have a nice footbridge, rustic logs. Lead over here could have another garden area, another wedding location. River, the valley, the willows. Plenty of room for a tent. Maybe cut down the trees over there for a larger clearing area. The willow branches moved and swayed, but there was no breeze. Could she have come back? He approached slowly. Last thing he needed to do was surprise some foul-tempered creature. Pushing aside the curtain, he was almost pleased at the tent-like room beneath the willow. You would need to have some benches added, a private place for lovers, and over there, he blinked at her. Perfect. Utterly perfect. The ivory pale skin, the delicate heart-shaped face, framed by the pale gold hair, the leaf green eyes large and clear. She seemed to study him as he walked slowly to her. Tall, slender, he had never believed in love at first sight. However, lust was very much real, and he shifted uncomfortably. Another dress, clinging to the sweet curves of her body, then floating like the willow branches around her legs. The gray-brown color almost matched the bark of the tree behind her. Even the pattern of it reminded him of the bark. You are perfect. She blushed and laughed. He was angry at himself. That was not what he had wanted to say, but her laughter made his body tighten and fire flow through his body. Never had he heard such a lovely sound. He wanted to hear her sigh and moan, say his name. He wanted her more than any woman he had ever met. I mean, hello. You seem a bit far off the normal paths.
Oh, I'm at home in these woods. I've been here as long as I can remember.
Her voice was soothing. He normally wasn't one to stand the chatter of women. Her, she could read a phone book to him and he would love it. How did you get up here? That hike is a nightmare. A shake of her hair sent it dancing softly.
I do not know what you're talking about.
I'm the one that's buying this land. Made a deal with the county when I found out it's actually not part of the park officially. Going to put in a resort and make this place worth something.
It is already worth something to those who know the value of it.
He was amazed at the eyes. Every shade of green was faceted within them. No browns or murky tones. Perfect eyes. Perfect, flawless face. Perfect, rose-pink lips. I think I want you for my wife, as silly as that might sound.
I cannot be your wife, nor any man's wife.
He smiled. No, you will be mine. I always get what I want.
Not this time.
She stepped behind the tree just out of sight. He was up for a chase and stepped after her. Nothing. The branches, just as thick on this side, were perfectly still. The water showed no ripples. He looked up at just the tree above. Where the hell had she gone? He had other things to do as he continued the process to acquire the land. Money was always useful to grease the right wheels. But he swore someone was trying to put a stop to his purchase. Paperwork kept vanishing. People didn't call back. Phone numbers would be wrong. He wanted to go back up to the willow grove. This time he would catch her. Drag her back if he had to. This time he would get her name. It took a week before he could return to the grove. She was in another green dress, or maybe the one from the first day. She was again beneath the willow, bare feet trailing in the water. Name? He ordered breathlessly.
Dirt, river, water, stone.
She motioned to or picked up each as she named it. A faint smile sparkled in her eyes. No, damn it, your name. A shrug, and she let a handful of dried leaves drift into the river valley.
Sally.
He frowned. A horridly common name. It did not fit her. Well, names could be changed. Sophia. He would call her Sophia. Name changes were just paperwork, yes? His wife, Sophia. That sounded perfect. As elegant and lovely as she was, his peers would be envious at the beauty he had managed to catch. Without buying her from some third-rate country, he moved towards her as she stood up and shot the last of the debris from her hands, a habit he would have to break once her hands were manicured. Again she walked out of sight for a moment. Her wet footprints led to the tree trunk, then vanished. He went home and got drunk. Something was not adding up here. Something tickled his mind, half remembered but just out of reach. His grandmother, crazy old broad, always reading useless folk tales to him. The next day he started researching. He had to be crazy for even considering any of this, but one of the first things that made it real was an Irish word for willow. Sally, pronounced as Sally. Selkies and sea maids. That was the tales his grandmother had told him. Magical beauties one could capture if one took the binding from them. A fey bride. No, not bride. No one would have a record she existed. His toy for the rest of his life. Unable to escape him. Unable to refuse him. The tree was what bound her to the land, what kept her from being claimed. All he had to do was chop down the tree. The tree was old, but willow was a softwood. Chainsaw? No, something about iron. So an iron axe. He could do it. No way he was going to allow anyone else to steal the girl. He brought soft rope, an iron axe, a heavy tarp on the next hellish hike through the forest. For once, not being tripped or slapped in the face. He could almost think the trees were avoiding the axe. Soon many of them would feel the chainsaw's bite, he thought smugly. But first to claim the real, live fairy for his own. She wasn't immediately in sight as he pushed the branches aside. Rather, she was in a fork of the tree above him.
Won't work.
She half smirked at him. Oh, it will work. And when I have you home, I will teach you to respect me. I will never be carried from this forest alive. He didn't say a word, just struck maliciously out at the tree. It felt good to attack it, to see chunks of it ripped out. The wood was the color of her hair, he realized. Another gleeful laugh, and he lashed out again and again at the annoyances coming to his mind. This was for that clerk that couldn't keep track of his papers. This for the judge, more interested in sleeping than signing the order. This for that little stuck-up bitch of a realtor. Crack! The tree leaned, then fell with a soft thud. He dropped the axe and leapt up onto the fallen trunk, finding her tangled in the branches unconscious. Must have hit her head, or shock. It didn't matter as he ran his hand over her body, now his. Quickly tying her hands and feet, he wrapped her tight in the tarp and headed back down the mountain to his waiting car. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, never wiggled or struggled. He walked out to the road, heading for the small gravel parking lot on the other side, stopping in confusion at the 2 police cars, the sudden wail of a siren, the orders to drop to his knees. Why did they have their guns trained on him? She was ripped from his arms as he protested. A heavy fist struck his jaw as a booted foot hit him in the back, knocking him to the ground. Laying there furiously ranting about suing them into poverty, he watched them unroll the tarp. Blood. Red blood ran from the tarp. Then her head rolled out, coming to rest a foot from his own face, the dead green eyes staring into his unblinking. The police were cursing. A foot impacted his ribs with a breath-stealing slam. You monster! They had it all wrong. They had to see she wasn't human, he babbled as they struck out at him, as he resisted arrest. Finally, he knew it was true. He wouldn't take her from the forest. He was going to die here on this cracked asphalt. His legacy was to be the axe murderer, caught in the act. They walked in near silence. Most carried lanterns. At the lead were 3 people. 2 carried infants. 1 babbled softly in her parents' arms. The other was in a basket, silent and staring at the world, with willow leaf green eyes. The leader held a small casket in his cupped hands, the horned headdress of a druid making him stand out. As they walked, people, youths, adults, elders, men, women, appeared seemingly from behind trees at random and watched. As they neared the glade with the standing stones and the fallen willow, 2 more joined them, Native Americans. 1 elder who watched with ancient eyes, 1 younger, medicine man and his apprentice. They bowed heads and took a place beside the leader. The group circled around the stones as the medicine man and the leader with the casket stepped into the middle. Voices lifted into a chant. 2 were reciting a song in a native dialect. The rest sang in Gaelic. No one seemed to mind the difference. In fact, the 2 were blending into a soaring melody. The 2 infants were brought forward and laid side by side in the soft grass. Something gleamed and glittered like fireflies about the 2 then, flickering off to a spot down near the river from the fallen tree. The group moved to form a path between the stones and the river location. Lanterns held aloft. 1 man stepped forward smiling and gathered the quiet child from the basket. He cradled her against his uniform, smiling as her hand grabbed his badge. The medicine man's apprentice moved to help with digging a hole where the false fireflies swarmed. Within the soft cradle of earth they laid the infant. The leader opened the casket and withdrew what looked like a dried out piece of meat and laid it beside the child. The thing swelled and glistened, turning bright red and bloody as it started to pulse in a slow heartbeat. Each member of the group, from youngest to oldest, came forward, adding a handful of earth to refill the cradle. The infant squealed and kicked her tiny legs as the dirt tickled over her. The other infant, still laying within the stone circle, also began squealing and flailing tiny arms. A woman smiled and brushed muddy fingers against her cheek fondly. Again they chanted and sang the duet, lifting and falling in joy and sorrow. The moon rose, and where the mound of disturbed earth was, a willow sapling now grew. The watchers in the forest smiled and vanished. The group returned their attention to the remaining child. The officer stepped forward and picked her up, his wife stepping from the group and wrapping an arm about his waist. "This is our daughter. As of old we hold the pact. As of old we raise this child to guard this land. I bind my daughter to the spirit of Sally. May she grow in the grace of the goddess." The leader and the medicine man each stepped forward and placed matching wreaths of willow branches on the child's head. "Great Spirit, bless this child with laughter. Mother, hold your daughter within your heart," they murmured at the same time. The child reached a hand up to grab at the tickling leaves and giggled. The group scattered about the clearing, taking blankets and food from backpacks. Throughout the night they celebrated the new lives and mourned the loss of the eldest willow. The now empty basket became a safe bed for the child when it tired, sleeping safe beneath the willow sapling. The medicine man poked at the fallen willow trunk with his walking stick. Rotted, the tree would have fallen within the next spring rains. The druid stepped behind him, which is why she allowed herself to become the sacrifice. It was almost time for her rebirth. The old man nodded. One of the original trees, was it not? A few still remain, the ones our forefathers brought from the old country. Do you ever wonder just how confused your own ancestors must have been to watch the crazy white men burying infants in the earth, only to have them become trees? The spirits told them you were coming, and to protect you, so you could protect them. He lifted a hand to the forest. Until they could protect all of us. The druid clapped a hand on the old man's shoulder. The loophole is closed now. No one will be able to take this land and threaten the Shade Droy again. So quoth this raven.
Will of the Wisp by Bear 64. Aloise's heart swelled with pride as she tramped towards the brook from which she and her family collected water each day, a cold, clear rill that flowed from the land that rose to the west of Brookside, from the big thicket forest. Her mother and grandmother had told her many tales of fantastic beings that dwelled under its forbidding branches and in the shadows that they cast. Today, though, the sun shone brightly and the air was warm with spring, and she had finally been allowed to retrieve a bucket of water on her own. She pulled along a small cart that she and her big brother Robbie had cobbled together. The clearing that led up to the trees that lined the winding stream was full of flitting birds, and their songs filled the air with sounds. Vari-colored feathers painted the meadow with a dazzling array of colors. Insects buzzed and chirruped and occasionally landed before her approach. The flowers clumped in multicolored arrays that gave off a clean, natural odor. It was a perfect day. There was no better way to describe it. Although she was very clever, at age 5, almost 6, she'd have exclaimed. She didn't possess the language to express it, yet her heart felt warm with the love for her home, her little place in the world. Shigao clung fiercely to the great horned owl as they raced towards the ford of trolls. The great bird was unhappy to have traveled in the bright light of day, but it couldn't be helped. Word had come that Trellings, smallest of the trollish folk, but much larger than his own people, had been seen at the fjord. This meant that they once more posed a threat to the Duanabiaga folk. The stream was the agreed-upon border between these enemies. The ford had been the meeting place for as long as they'd met, whether in war or to negotiate the intervals of peace between the natural enemies. In recent years, tall human folk had settled near the ford and frequented the area to obtain water. They were no direct threat, though they had strange practices when it came to cutting down trees, only to replace them with smaller plants. The benefit was that their presence mostly disturbed the Trellings, as it prevented them sneaking into the south side of the brook to raid the resources of others. The Duanabiaga lived more to the west, inside the big thicket, and on the south side of the waterway, on the opposite side from the tall folk. Shiogo guided by the large predatory bird along the sparkling ribbon of the water that passed below them. There, in broad daylight, a company of trailings, 25 or better. They carried their long spears, and in lieu of their usual small round shields, they wore large rectangular models, slung over their hunched shoulders as they waded along the north bank towards the ford. The dun and black stripes of their furred bodies was best employed for camouflage at night, but worked well enough under the shadows of the trees, even in the bright spring sunlight. It appeared to be a war party, a large group by the standard of their species. Sunk in concentration, he almost lost his perch as his mount suddenly dipped and banked sharply to one side. The raucous sound of a shrieking crow shattered the air behind Shigo, and startled him so that he leaned low onto the back of the large raptor he rode. Another of the black-feathered creatures swept past and attempted to grasp at him. Hard Grip, the great horned owl, pumped his wings to gain altitude as the Trellings looked up and pointed, then rasped out the foul language of their kind. However, their laughter was cut short when Hardgrip snatched at the neck of one of the scavengers and snapped its head from its body in mid-flight. With a small spray of blood, the crow and its head plunged to the ground to crumple near its erstwhile allies. The Trellings' laughter turned to angry shouts and spear-shaking. Shigao would have loved to attack them, but he was alone and needed to gather his forces. At that point, the rest of the murder of crows arrived, and he was overwhelmingly outnumbered. The chase was on, back to Grove Haven to warn his folk and raise their army for a counter-raid. If he could make it, they would defeat the Trellings and their crow scouts. If not, with no warning, the Trellings and their minions would strike, and the Duana Biega and their own animal allies would suffer. Eloise was in no hurry. She had asked if it was okay to watch some of the animals on the short trek, and her mother had told her it was fine, but not to dawdle too near the forest. She was afraid that Mother would send Robbie along, but so far he hadn't made an appearance. He was working with the other boys his age to drive away birds from the freshly planted fields. Grandma Sarah had a sore toe, so she would be at their 2-room cabin, likely making something tasty for their next meal. There wouldn't be much, but Eloise knew that her grandmother could cook whatever there was better than anyone. As she drew closer to the little brook, she noticed that it had become impossible to spy out any more birds. The insects had gone silent, and the small diurnal creatures that might normally stand and stare for just a moment failed to peek out from the depths of the trees at either side of the meadow. They'd become more cautious since they realized that many of the boys carried slings and were on constant lookout for small, furry, edible creatures. Yet several of the bolder types would usually show themselves to little Eloise. Even at such a young age, she had such a way of charming the animals and birds. However, today, it looked like she'd have to carry water without the company of any kind. She heard cawing of crows in the distance and some other odd noises. She didn't pay much attention. Nature was always busy with something. And those who lived in that particular forest were mysterious and often dangerous. Everybody said so. Hard Grip and Shigao made it nearly home before they had to once again engage in another aerial dogfight with the murder of crows that had followed them. That group had swollen to over 20 and would easily be able to take down the owl and his rider. Hard Grip was straining and obviously tired, yet he banked and pumped his wings to climb, preparing to fight as best he could. The members of the murder focused intently on their pursuit and did not note the squadron of raptors that launched from below and behind them. Shigao peered back over his shoulder to see the welcome sight that greeted him. He signaled Hardgrip, who turned his climb into a sudden dive. It took the crows by surprise for just a moment, and they swirled around one another as they adjusted their directions of travel. The momentary confusion and change of direction allowed the owls of the Duambiega avianators to reach the altitude so that their riders could launch arrows towards the erstwhile attackers. The arrows were tipped with toxins that would kill their enemies very quickly. Crows were cunning, and the members of this murder quickly realized that they would not be able to win this battle without their ground troops to draw some of the squadron from the air fight. Several fell to arrows, and while all of the larger birds, mostly owls, made it through with only minor wounds, a few of the riders were less fortunate. Once the joining of the birds and the wee folk resolved into a short aerial engagement, Escale and Riquot, cousins, each received wounds, but then, as the murder seemed to scatter and retreat, they once more coalesced and swarmed over the eldest owl, Sharpbeak, and her rider, Elder Grain. The avianators had swept away from the original fighting zone, each in pursuit of escaping enemies. When the remainder of the crows had turned as one to circle back and attack her, the sable-plumed carrion eaters were more nimble in flight than were the large birds, though much less powerful individually. Yet numbers told. The leader of the crows, a large specimen, took hold of Elder Grain's arm and the one in which she held the staff of her bow, and snapped and tugged her arm from her body. Blood splashed, and she shrieked in pain and rage. Yet she was a warrior of great repute and ability. With her last strength, she plunged the arrow that she had been preparing to shoot into the wing of the crow leader. Her mount banked away from the battle and headed toward the Grove Haven proper, the body of his small passenger already limp and spirit fled. The leader of the murder called to call his folk together, and they turned to head back to their own approaching forces. He began to miss beats with the wings that the Duambiega had wounded, and presently plunged to earth, to die on the rocks beside the brook. Aloise had filled the bucket, and now strained to get it into her small cart without splashing away too much of it. She felt a moment of triumph as the bottom of the now heavy vessel came to rest solidly on the floor of her cart. Mother and grandmother would be proud of her. Even Robbie might be nice for a little while. She was distracted by the cawing of a murder of crows that approached from upstream of the brook. Probably the ones I heard earlier, she thought a little absently. Crows are no danger, except in the fields. Robbie and the other boys would stop them if they went that way. They passed overhead, and their raucous cries sounded angry. She saw them settle just beyond the trees from her perspective. Then the shadows came alive with menacing figures of another kind, monsters that for all the world looked like tailless raccoons, with blunt features that stood on their hind legs and brandished spears and javelins, and wore armor of leather and hard tree bark. They quickly surrounded the small human. She was tall compared to them, but they were well armed and strong. They averaged just above waist height on her, but between muscle and fur they bristled and menaced her and caused her to step behind her cart in fear. She saw that others moved in quickly to surround her. She had nowhere to run. The largest of them stalked up to her and chittered in a voice that was deeper than his size would have indicated. Eloise just stared in incomprehension. The being stomped his foot and shook his spear. He raised the flint point to her face and chittered loudly. She still had no idea what he wanted, and the sharp point scared her. Yet it also made her angry. She knew that it was dangerous to put sharp objects near another person. With no other option, she batted aside the spear and said, "No! Don't you point that at me!" The trailing stepped back in astonishment. He was clearly unused to being disobeyed, much less defied. Another of his band approached and spoke to him in their language. "Chief Tanglefoot, I can speak some of their language of the, Umanish. Perhaps I can help. You wish her to come with us?" Tanglefoot looked at the feather-bedeckled shaman, still angry. "Yes, tell the thing to come with us if she has value to her people. Then maybe we can bargain for them to leave. Move to the side of the water with the riders. Let 'em take their land and trees." The shaman approached the young human and spoke as clearly as he was able. "You, human, girl, you, come." With the last, he waved Aloise to follow him. She hesitated, but then saw the big trelling heft its spear and lower its eyebrows, in very clear communication of menace. Grandma Sarah fretted over Alois. She knew that it was important to teach children self-sufficiency, but this close to the big thicket there was always danger. Those woods were haunted by all sorts of unsettling creatures and beings. Everybody said so. Her sore toe had her seated on the bench to do what work she was able, but if her granddaughter did not return soon, she would use her walking stick to hobble down to the creek to get her. Presently her grandson Robbie entered the little cabin. He looked annoyed. "Grandma, have you seen Alois? Ma told me to go find her and make sure she don't stray into the woods." This one could run no sore toes, she thought keenly. Chiago gathered with the others around the now lifeless body of Grain. She had been his mentor and his aunt, a close relative and leader of their clan, a fixture in his life. The Duane Biega wailed and keened in grief all around as he knelt and took her ravaged body in his arms. He led a procession to the great oak and carried her up along the hidden stairway that wound irregularly around the large trunk of the tree, and eventually to the platform hidden within the great fork. He laid her poor broken remains at the foot of the twin thrones of the king and queen. Queen Elias wept openly for her fierce aunt and knelt beside her, caressing her face and keening. King Lardit wept openly but quietly. He had dearly loved the old warrior, and she had trained him in his youth. "What has happened to our dear lady warrior, my brother-in-law?" Sheog looked up, and his tear-stained features morphed from grief to anger. "Trellings, my king, a large band, 25 or more, headed this way. Their crow scouts attacked and followed me. We drove them from our skies, but the war band approaches. I beg to lead our forces in the attack, to slaughter the enemy and drive them from our world." The queen rose and glanced at her brother before gazing in earnest at her husband. "We must go forth and strike them while they are still marching. We can take them from above, even with their crows, once they are under the crowded branches. Our squirrel riders can bombard them with stones and arrows and fire globes. When they flee into the open areas, our avianators can pummel them into submission. It is the way we have fought from time immemorial. We shall always triumph in the end." Liara thought carefully for a moment, his grief forgotten in the urgency of the moment. "I am concerned. The Trelling have not come in such great numbers for many years. Perhaps they have a new leader or a new plan. They are clever and mean." He raised a hand to stave off objections, I know that their minds are no match for ours, nor are their crafting skills. Yet we must not make the mistake of underestimating us. They never come as far as the fjord without our scouts detecting them, and they have never attacked in daylight. Perhaps something more has changed." He gazed around the room, but no one answered. Eventually Shigao cleared his throat. "Perhaps they've learned from watching the human folk, the large ones on the other side of the water. They seem to move about exclusively during daylight. Strange creatures, everybody says so. In any case, we have very little time. We must gather our forces, whether we attack or defend." The king and queen looked at one another for a moment, nodded as one, and then spoke as one. "Let it be done. Riders, to the feud." "So what do we do with the Omen thing while we are busy with the attack?" Tanglefoot asked the shaman and his senior advisors. The large being tripped along just behind them, flanked by a pair of guards. She attempted to speak, to ask questions, but even the shaman could barely understand her. Tanglefoot grew ever more angry by the moment. The shaman, White Ears, assured him that the creature was a small child. He was concerned that the parents might come looking for it. Such a being would be difficult to fight. This entire venture had been costly with little gain. Now the war band would have to take care of a giant child while attempting a surprise raid. White Ears offered, "Perhaps I could stay with the child during the battle, my chief." Tanglefoot eyed him askance. "You have other purposes. It is your job to attend those wounded by the poisoned arrows, to test the cure that you claim to have found. We cannot spare warriors to watch it. Perhaps we should just kill it and put it in the water. Surely something will eat it." Alois was frightened. She tried to tell these creatures that she wasn't allowed to go into the big thicket, that it was not safe. However, they could clearly not understand her. Maybe they just didn't want to listen. She knew that soon. Mother Burl or Grandma Sarah would get worried and come to look for her. How would they find her? She was tempted to cry, but she still felt some defiance. The two that had spoken at her previously now gathered with 3 others and chattered in their 2 deep voices as they waded along, ever deeper into the trees and other plants. They occasionally cast glances in her direction, so she knew that they spoke of her. She did not like the big one that had pointed its spear in her face. His countenance looked more wicked than the others, like some monster from a fairy tale. Then she heard a cry from behind. In the far distance, it was her brother Robbie. She drew in a breath and called back over her shoulder, "I'm here, Robbie. Come get me, the monsters." She let out breath in a whoof. One of the guards had used the butt of his spear to strike her in the tummy. Her eyes teared and she came close to bawling in earnest. But then she grew angry again as the little monster drew back for another strike, this time with the point. Her face flushed and she kicked the ugly being in the face. Then she turned and sprinted back the way they had come, calling out for her brother as she ran. The war band of the Duanabiega climbed aboard their various mounts and set out quickly above the meandering stream. They were able to move in an almost straight line that avoided the various twists and bends of the flowing water. Shigao led on a fresh owl, Fantail. She was lighter of frame than Hardgrip, but she was very fast and very fierce. She was young, but her nature would help her to defend against the crows. They made good time, and soon the scouts, the freshly bandaged Esquel and Resque, circled back to them and presently flanked him. Esquel gave the report. "Up ahead, not far, they will enter a grove of trees. About the time of our fur riders arrive. The crows spotted us and rose from the trees, but they settled back quickly. They seemed distracted." Shigao signaled that he understood. and then he used his horn to alert his band that they approached the enemy. Risco directed his avian down into the trees to pass on word to those who rode the large breed of squirrels that resided in the area and were happy to trade rides for food, shelter, and security. Then up ahead he spotted the Trellings. Odd. Why are they facing away from us? Unfortunately, one of them still paid attention, and with a hoarse cry alerted the others. The battle was soon fully engaged. Alois knew that the monsters would pursue her. She ran and dodged along the stream, but at the bend she chose to run straight ahead, straight back towards the shallow place where she'd gathered the water. She crossed the water over a fallen tree and sped onward, but soon the trees grew thicker and she had to turn. Then she encountered the roots of a forest giant that had toppled and left its now leafless corpse in her path. Before long, and before she knew it, she was headed in the wrong direction. The worst direction, back towards the Trellings. Tanglefoot yelled and tried to beat his troops into formation, but they were taken by surprise after all. The confusion when the Umanish child had run. Arrows, javelins, and stones rained down from above, and several of its warriors were already down, mostly with injuries, but two lay very still, in the way that only dead may achieve. His surprise daylight attack had turned on him, and his troops had been the ones to face the fury of the wee folk, the riders. Still, he was a forceful leader and an accomplished fighter. He soon had the warriors in order, and each interlocked and raised the shields they'd made from horn and hardwood. It had taken years to gather enough horn of the right type, but at the end of winter and the floods that came with it, they discovered the body of a large dead creature with enormous horns. It was enough to equip his entire force. Horn over hardwood would stop anything that the riders could fling at them. Even the little balls that contained flammable liquid could not melt the horn, and the sheathing on the shields would prevent the wood from catching fire and rendering the shields useless, or worse, a hazard for the bearer. He no longer cared about the Umanish child. That was a battle for another day. Perhaps her people would not even believe her when she told them what she'd seen. Better yet, something in the forest might eat her. He grinned briefly in malicious glee, then turned his attention back to the battle. Xiagao was shocked by the tight formation that the Trellings presented and the effective shields, definitely different from the little round ones they typically carried. That would make things more difficult. They'd recovered from the surprise attack more quickly than past bands had done. It was that big one, clearly the chief. He'd gotten them in hand. It wouldn't do to have an effective leader in their ranks. He determined that he would take on the chief himself. Remove that one and the rest would fall. He urged Fantail to rise, then stooped towards the fearsome Trellig leader. The monstrously large figure came quickly into focus, and before the talons of the war owl could strike, the beast flung its javelin upward and braced itself behind its shield. The javelin struck true, and Fantail spread her wings to halt the plunge. She managed but just, but landed hard beyond and behind Tanglefoot. Xiagao quickly released his harness and ushered the large bird behind a stone. He saw that the wound was bad, but perhaps not fatal if he could get a healer on site quickly enough. That would mean quickly winning the battle. That would still mean taking out the Trellig chief, who had returned his attention to keeping his troops disciplined and focused on repelling the attacks of the Duani Biega. If they could hold off until fatigue sent the riders reeling, then they could press forward and attack the village proper. Xiagao made his mount as comfortable as possible, and then turned back towards the affray. He climbed up onto the stone and readied his bow. the mightiest of his clan, and prepared to loose an arrow on his nemesis. Eloise slowed when she heard odd noises from the area to her right. She decided that the noises sounded pretty much human, but very distant. She quickly headed in that direction. Shortly she stumbled onto the oddest scene she'd encountered in her entire life. A battle in miniature raged just ahead of her. Tiny beings about the size of her dolly rode animals and attacked the monsters who'd held her captive. She stopped in her tracks to watch how it would unfold. The unpleasant one just stood behind the rest and stamped and roared at them. He did not notice her. As she turned, she felt a sharp stab in her hand, like the wasp that had stung her last summer. She couldn't help it. It hurt and surprised her. So she cried out, and the mean creature heard her. He turned, and when he saw her, he shook with fury, gripping his spear tightly, and ran at the little girl with murderous intent. With all of his rage focused on the child, he did not note the Duana Biega archer, who readied a fresh stab. Tanglefoot screeched out his fury and ran at Eloise with murderous intent. The child was flustered and frantic with pain and fear. She turned about and looked for a place to run, but the monster, its fur standing on end and its features twisted with rage, menaced her with its spear and lunged towards her. She watched as a feathered shaft appeared to grow from its right eye. It fell forward and rolled to a stop at her feet, where it sprawled and laid still. She watched for only a moment and then began to grow dizzy and faint. She heard the clamor of arms and cries of anger, and the screams and moans of suffering and death from the nearby battle as her consciousness faded. As the long gray tunnel closed about her vision, and the sounds blended and roared in her ears, she swore she saw a tiny man, dressed in a kilt of feathers and leaves, approach and stare at her face. Silly, though. No one was that small, and they certainly didn't have green hair. "We have to get her back to her people," Shigao insisted. "They can best tend to her. She's big enough that the toxins may not be fatal." There were murmurs from around the moot circle, but not much enthusiasm. The clan had been damaged greatly in the battle. They had their own wounded and dead to care for, and a few prisoners to question and execute. They had no time for strange giant children. Let the child's own people care for her. "You and 3 others may," the queen, his eldest sister, began to speak, but was interrupted by terribly loud sounds of brush being trampled nearby, and the loud shouting in some strange language. Her features dissolved into a mask of horror. "Flee! Hide from the human folk!" Robbie stumbled into the small clearing and found his sister stretched out on the ground before him. She appeared to be in a deep sleep. She did not thrash, but he could tell by the look on her face that it was a troubled sleep. He tried to wake her, but was unable, so he ran to the nearby brook and dipped the bottom edge of his shirt into the water. He washed her face, and her features relaxed a little. He noted that her skin was very hot to the touch. Then he saw the mark on her hand. It was swollen and the skin was irritated. He feared that some venomous creature had stung or bitten her. He had to get her home, so he placed his hands under her arms and began to drag her back towards home. Eventually he reached a trail that ran along the stream and stopped to rest. He remembered their little cart. If he could get her into that, he could get her home quickly and with little effort. He hated to abandon her, but had little choice. He could also run all the way back to the village and get help. His thoughts raced. He leaned his young sister against the roots of a willow tree and hid her as best as he could in its arms, then fled back to where they normally filled their buckets. He did not notice the small figure that had haunted his trail and peered through the leaves as he pulled and tugged and sweated with his efforts. Shigao and his hastily selected band of rescuers watched in horror as even the bigger child fled and left the little girl alone and helpless in the big thicket. He set up the other three in a defensive perimeter and walked out boldly to check on the child. They had an antidote, but he wasn't sure it would work on a creature such as this. It might kill her since it was a counter-poison. He used his knife to cut a small drain hole in her wound so that the poison and tainted blood could leak from her body. He fetched her some water in a large leaf. There was little else he could do. Then he heard more strange, loud noises. The day had been long and filled with oddities. "She's over here!" Robbie shouted over his shoulder to his mother and the other 4 people who had come along to help her search for her child. They soon had Alois in hand and started to carry her back to the cabin in the settlement. They discussed that maybe Grandma Sarah or one of the other wise elders could come up with some sort of cure. There was clearly a bite on the child's hand. One could see what looked like tiny teeth marks. Shigao sent out 2 of his party to follow the human folk back to their settlement. He and the last of the party headed home to gather some owls and what they hoped would be a cure for the little girl. When they arrived, there was another moot in progress. The entire remaining clan members surrounded the 3 prisoners they'd taken. They'd killed or seriously wounded a dozen of the trailing, then slaughtered those who were wounded, at least the ones that hadn't died from poisoning. Some of the others would likely succumb on their journey home. This was now a very personal feud. They'd lost 5 of their own outright, and possibly up to 7, based on the severity of the wounds suffered by 2 of their number. This was all in addition to losing Elder Grain in the initial skirmish. Many others had suffered less wounds, and several mounts had been killed or wounded. The Trollings had much which to answer. The 3 prisoners all had wounds. The one dressed in feathers and bone, clearly some sort of spiritual leader, was least injured. He was clearly the most intelligent, and they had grilled him with numerous questions, most of which he'd answered. It was possible that he lied, but there was no reason. The Trolling host was defeated. They'd lost more than half their numbers. The Duena Biega would counter-strike within days. More precisely, nights. They'd marshal every member of the clan who could ride and shoot or cast, and descend on the home of their hated enemy. They would slaughter every last one of them. Shigeo arrived in time for the big question. Why? Why attack in this way and violate a treaty that had led to years of peace and stability? White Ears hung his head in abject defeat. He no longer feared for his life. He knew it was forfeit. There was nothing to salvage, and while he would answer the questions about the already failed raid, he would give no secrets to the defense of trailing home. He felt that answering what he could might buy him a swift and merciful death. There are a few reasons. Tanglefoot was a new chief. He wanted to prove himself, and felt that the treaties his uncle, Warty-Face, had made did not apply to him. He decided on a daytime raid for surprise. He also had new horn shields that the tribe had gathered over the years for defense and maybe some other advantages. It seemed like a good time to raid. King Lairda stepped closer. You started to say that you had a cure. A cure for what? White Ears clutched his mouth shut and glared. He knew he'd made a mistake, but was determined to avoid saying more. Yet, as he thought about it, he decided that there was no real reason to hide the fact that he'd developed a surefire cure for the poisoned arrows and javelin points of the Duana Briega. The king of the wee folk was clearly growing frustrated and angry. I came up with a cure for your toxin. It's a counterpoison. I've tested it a few times on animals and twice on other trailing folk. In every case, it has worked. Though it was improper to do so, since the king had not stepped back. Shigao stepped up to the trailing shaman. From what is your cure made? The trailing blanched and looked at his feet, then shook his head. I will not tell you that. It will only allow you to make something worse. Shigao did not want to give away a state secret that might compromise the safety of his people. Yet the Trellings were defeated and would soon be wiped from this part of the big thicket, and the life of a child was at stake. We use a toxin based on the kickapoo plant. White Ears looked up slowly and thought for a moment. Then, with nothing to lose, he nodded. I used the same. Grandma Sarah and Mother Pearl sat on either side of the cot that held sweet Alois's burning little frame. She was racked with fever, and they knew that she would likely fade away in the early morning hours. They'd done all they could, and Mother Pearl wiped the child's face with a damp cloth. If only the fever would break, she half thought and half prayed. They hadn't had time for tears. Those would come later. Robbie sat silently near the cold hearth. He was terrified for his little sister. They fought some, but he genuinely loved her and wanted her to be safe. Yet he was helpless to do anything. Around midnight, Robbie started awake from a nightmare and looked around in the dark. They had 2 windows and a small window in the door. He thought he saw an odd light approach the window over Alois's cot. Look, he whispered, shouted, and pointed towards the ever-brightening globe. His mother and grandmother both turned to see the luminous glowing ball that danced outside the window. Their mouths hung slack, and they made some sign for spiritual protection from evil beings. Yet the light was a cooling shade of blue, and once it steadied and reached the apex of its illumination, they could see it was nothing ill or awful. It hovered for a short time, then disappeared to one side. It soon shone through the other window, and then moved to the slot window in the door, then returned to the window above the sweet child's resting place. 3 times it made the circuit. Each time it hovered at Alois's window for a moment before it continued on its journey. After the 3rd pause, it flew directly away from the window and eventually winked out somewhere in the dark. There was a movement on the cot. A tiny hand reached up and rubbed its tiny eyes. Then a tiny voice murmured, I'm so thirsty. I want my bucket of water. Shigao urged Hardgrip on home. His mission successful, the human folk child would recover. He had used the wisp light to blind the larger beings and hide his presence. It was a handy tool for guiding large beings away from Grove Haven or sacred plants or sacred places. For some reason they were fascinated and would follow the lights without care, even into a swamp or the deep shadows of the big thicket, often to their doom. But this time he'd used it to save a life, and so ended the longest and strangest day of his life. So quoth this raven. My darlings, thank you to Bear Lair for sharing this with us. It was developed from a family story of his, which is quite interesting, and you can find that below the story on the subreddit if you want to know.
Called Heir to Cernunnos, and it's by Absent-Minded Nihilist. Before I let the girl with the antlers into my house that December, I had thought that I was a practical sort of person. I was training to become a trauma surgeon, and I thought myself capable of cutting the limb, so to speak, of making the tough call, the hard but cruel decision. Ever the utilitarian,
I'd seen the man with the bear's head stalking the woods on my properties days before she came to my door begging for entrance. There was no way she wasn't what he was looking for. And I had seen those teeth, yellowed tips pointing out from under his lips, and the muscled slope of his back, his enormous, brutal hands, discolored by tanning acid. Barring the door would have been the safer option. And yet, you didn't hear her as she pleaded me to open the door. She was barefoot, and it was 2 a.m., and it was snowing so hard you couldn't see your hand if you reached out to grab a railing. "Please," she begged. "I've been walking for so long. It's been snowing. You can't see my tracks. Please, no one will know I'm even here. He won't know, I swear." So I let her in. The points of her antlers pressed up against me as she embraced me. Thanking me breathlessly, I pulled a jacket from the stand by the door and wrapped it around her shoulders. I found myself patting her back absently, murmuring vague reassurances. I let go suddenly, conscious of my hand, my arms, the places her skin touched mine. I walked into the kitchen and she followed. She was warier of me now, like an injured animal that takes the food from your hand and shrinks away again. The initial panic was gone, and now she was clearly focused on making sure I would not be a bigger danger than what lay outside. I felt her eyes on me as I rose and tore open 2 packets of instant cider mix, poured them into cups. She visibly flinched when I turned the stove on, and the sudden movement caused me to drop the pan. Resulting clatter was a blow to the ribs with a tire iron. She scrambled back, knocking over the chair, backwards over the couch, eyes wild. "Hey," I said, carefully, hands up, gaze lowered. "I'm sorry." I inched closer, leaving her the chance to pull away. She didn't. I think we scared each other there. "I'm sorry about that. Can I help you up?" She hesitated, and then put her hand in mine. And so it was that we found ourselves seated opposite one another at my kitchen table. She had cider, and I had finished mine and moved on to a bottle of scotch. Lord knows I needed it. She drained her mug and pulled the jacket closer. "Have you seen him?" "He comes every 6 days, patrolling. He came by 2 days ago." I do not need to ask who she's talking about. I wasn't the first to see him. My neighbor Josie, though separated from me by a thick pine grove and a river, had come to me telling me she'd seen him coming my way. "The police can't find him," she said. "He's never there long enough for them to see him. It's not just me who saw him. He killed John Carver's dog, snapped her neck when she charged at him, and he dragged off one of Lizzie Jackson's calves. Just slung it over his shoulder and walked off with it." She paused and gave me a steely look. "You know, Cassidy Jones, and I know what you'll say, you want to think it's a man in a mask, but I've never seen a mask that could change the shape of your face so that you had a snout, or the length of your tongue, and I ain't never seen a mask that could drool." She did know me. It wasn't the first time she'd come to me with a report of something abnormal that I would dismiss with an eye roll. I paid too much for empirical, science-based med school education to pander to this sort of thing. But things kept appearing that I couldn't explain, and I was forced to accept that this deep into the forest, the lines start to blur. We waited until evening, and then I scoped him out with the binoculars Josie had brought. One look was all I needed to know. That was no mask. The girl's voice brought me back to attention. "What's your name?" "Cassidy. You?" "Ari. Do you have a pregnancy test?" I blinked. "No," I said carefully. "Do you need one?" I'm not certain. I think I escaped in time, but they did drug me, and he might have gotten to me while I was sleeping, and..." Okay, Ari. "I'm a doctor." I hesitated. "If you like, I could take a look." "Yes, Please, I need to make sure. Please, I need to be sure he didn't touch me. I'll spare you the details, but there was no bruising on her legs or hips, or anything that would suggest that kind of violation she was afraid of. I told her this, and the tension she was holding in her shoulders visibly relaxed. There was a strange silence that I could not bring myself to interrupt, until finally I offered to let her use the shower. I left clean clothes outside the door and poured myself another scotch. Well, maybe more than one. When she came out, Ari's skin finally had some color in it, and her hair was no longer a matted mess. I realized with dull surprise that she was beautiful. Her antlers were exquisitely complex, branching and bifurcating to elegant points. The dark circles under her eyes and the prominence of her cheekbones accentuated it rather than diminished. It struck me that I was admiring the beauty of a traumatized girl, and I felt vaguely sick. "Hello," I said, suddenly unsure of myself. "Hello," Ari replied, giving me a smile that made me a bit giddy, though I told myself it was the scotch. It was the first time she'd smiled. Hot showers are the stuff of miracles. You look nice," I said, looking at the space directly to the left of her head. My shirt was far too big for her. I could still see beads of water in the space where her collarbone met her neck. I had a sudden urge to kiss her right there, to lick those droplets myself. I bit my tongue. No, Cassidy, I reminded myself. Traumatized. Definitely too much scotch. That and the rush you feel when surviving something dangerous. Thank you. Silence. You deserve an explanation. I shrugged and waved it off, though even a half hour earlier I would have jumped on the possibility of understanding anything about this mess. There was a beautiful girl in my house, wearing my shirt. The circumstances of how that came to happen were less than significant. Don't worry about it. Let me guess. Bearman is your ex? The smile vanished from her face, and I kicked myself. Something like that. I'm sorry, I didn't know. It's fine, I didn't expect you to. But I'm supposed to marry him. And then I'll bear his child. And after that, he'll chase me through the forest and let his hounds tear me to pieces. Immediately, I was stone cold sober. She said the whole thing the way you'd tell your family what happened at work the day after you came home. This, she said, gesturing to her antlers, happens once a generation in my family. Heir to Cyrnanos. It's a big deal. We don't know who it'll be. It takes a while for the antlers to grow in. The boys become the new head of the family. The girls, she paused. I wasn't sure if she'd continue. The day they started growing in, I cried myself to sleep. I tried to break one of them off, but I nearly bled to death. Grew right back anyway. They grow like bamboo. I could hear it in the night. It was sickening. Sure enough, I could see strange markings a little above the base of the right antler, where there was a difference in the grain. I reached out without thinking about it. "It's okay," she said. "You can touch it." I ran my thumb over it, paying attention to all the notches and whorls I could feel, until I came to my senses and pulled away. "You're probably hungry, yeah?" She nodded. "Yeah, okay, I don't have much in the fridge right now, so I was just going to call the pizza place." "Pizza sounds good." "Okay," I said, a little startled. "Did you think I didn't know what pizza was?" She gave me a crooked grin. Ari laughed, and I smiled in spite of myself. I desperately wanted to hear that laugh again. We weren't that isolated. I have banana peppers on my half. No problem. As I began to dial the number, she wandered over to the window, gazing out at the snow falling. "Hey, you said banana peppers, right?" No answer. Ari? Fuck. She breathed, knuckles white on the windowsill. He brought the dogs. I joined her at the window, and I saw him again, holding 3 rangy black hounds on rope leashes. Ari dropped from the window before he could see her. I followed suit. She had her hands in her mouth and gnawed desperately at them. Listen, my car is out front. He's out back. We can sneak in if we're careful. You can hide under some blankets in the back seat, all right? She shook her head violently. They can smell me. I went to the spice cabinet, grabbed the vanilla extract, and shook some into her palm. Rub this behind your ears. It'll confuse them. Are you sure? Trust me. Each step we took from the door to the car was agonizing. Each time the snow crunched under our feet, I flinched and turned to see if he was coming. I heard the breathy, guttural noises of his hands, and heard them whimper as they pulled at their leashes. But he never came. Ari was carrying her shoes by the laces between her teeth, and I saw that her feet were not human. Rather, they were shaped like those of a wolf, though hairless and splayed out over the ice. She moved quickly enough to get to the car before me, bundling herself up on the floor of the back seat. When I finally managed to get in, I'd lost all feeling in my fingers. When I started the car, I heard it roar to life. I heard Ari gasp under her blankets. All seemed quiet. I didn't dare to breathe. As I went to lift my foot from the brake, I heard something smash against the back of my window. When I looked in my rearview mirror, I forgot the fact I was drunk, exhausted, and that it was snowing like hell. I just drove. CMD 102. The Fairy Sweetheart. My younger brother Todd moved to Ireland in 2006 to get a fresh start. He was an incredibly talented guitarist and singer who had spent the entirety of his 20s wasting his talents on mediocre garage bands and pumping his body full of whatever drugs his meager paycheck from Walmart would buy him. After spending the months surrounding his 30th birthday in rehab, he decided to pack up and head to the Emerald Isle to do some soul-searching in the land of our ancestors. He was always proud of our Irish heritage, mostly because he claimed that it was the reason he could drink so much and not die from alcohol poisoning. We didn't hear much from him for the first year or so. He would occasionally send our mom a letter from a different town each time, letting her know he was still alive and sober. The trust that the later was true wasn't very strong. But at least he thought to let us know he wasn't in a gutter somewhere, checking it wasn't his strong suit when he spent his days with a needle in one hand and a pipe in the other. Sometime in the late 2007, he actually called. My mother was so happy to hear his voice, and even happier to notice that his words weren't slurred as he told her the great news. Todd had gotten a job. The owner of the small-town pub was a sweet old man who was letting him stay in the apartment above the bar, with the condition that he was to stay clean and sober. Apparently the old man had lost a son to addiction, and he was eager to help a recovering junkie find his feet, to make up for not helping his own blood in time. The next excited phone call came in the summer of 2008 and told us that the old man had discovered Todd's talents. He had asked my brother to put his beat-up acoustic guitar to use and perform in the pub every Saturday night in an effort to bring in a younger crowd. Music brings in the younger folk, he mused, and the younger folk bring friends and buy more expensive drinks. Todd's talents worked like a charm. Within a few weeks, word about his performance spread, and the pub was busier than ever. People had even started requesting that he sing for them while tending the bar during the week, which prompted the old man to add another performance on Wednesday nights. Todd loved every minute of his new small-town fame. In February of 2009, Todd called my mom on her birthday He had met a girl named Leannon. She had inspired him to stop performing covers of songs and start writing his own again. Mom said that she could hear the sugar seeping through his voice with every word he spoke about the girl. Todd was in love. Months passed, and Todd's good fortune kept coming on. He had been able to save up enough money to move out of the small apartment above the pub and into a slightly larger house in town. Leannon moved in with him a short while later, providing him domestic bliss for the first time in his life. A man who worked for a record company had come into the pub while in town visiting family. He watched Todd perform and offered him a contract on the spot. My brother finally got to live the life he dreamed about for a while. Todd released his first album in the spring of 2010. It did okay in Europe. He wasn't the slightest bit disappointed that it wasn't a chart topper. "It's rare for a musician to become famous overnight," he happily explained. "My next album will do even better. I'm already writing songs for it. Leannon is helping me so much. That girl is a lyrical genius." Soon after the release of Todd's album, his calls home became less frequent. He joked he was busy becoming the next Bono, so he didn't have time to pick up the phone and chat with the commoners. When he did call, he told us about performing in front of ever-growing crowds, signing autographs, and receiving strange presents from even stranger admirers. Mom noted that he sounded tired and that she hoped he was staying healthy. He assured her that he was fine. Leannon was taking good care of him. I wasn't so sure of that last part. See, Todd had joined Facebook in 2009. He was finally able to afford a smartphone and used it to join the world of social media. I remember showing Mom his profile picture, excited because it was the first time we'd seen his face since he left the U.S., and her being so proud of the fact that he had gained weight and looked healthy for the first time in what seemed like forever. As time went on, he lost that weight. Gray invaded his brown hair and beard. His skin grew paler than normal and had already shown signs of wrinkles. Todd turned 34 in September of 2010, but he looked like he had turned 60. Now I'm sure you're going to tell me the same thing I tried to tell myself. Drugs age people faster. Maybe it's the stress catching up to him. Some people just age worse than others. I tried to convince myself that the drastic change in appearance had a logical explanation. I really did, but something stuck out in the photo Todd posted to his timeline on his 34th birthday. His eyes. The whites of them had yellowed a bit. They were bloodshot, not in the way that's indicative of a recent high, but of several days without sleep. The smile on his face contracted the emotion in his eyes, because there was none. Todd had the eyes of a dead man. Fully convinced that something was very wrong, and determined to not let my brother slide into another desolate pit, I put in for vacation time at work and traveled to Ireland. At first I thought no one was home when I knocked on Todd's door. The curtains were all closed, and it took him several minutes to answer. When he finally came, his pallid face lit up in surprise. I could feel every one of his ribs against my arms as we embraced, and I tried not to flinch when I noticed his dry-lipped smile was full of teeth the color of ash. I followed him as he shuffled through the house, leading me to the kitchen where he said he had been making lunch. The place was well organized and clean, save for the dust that clung to the shelves and floated in the air. "I don't have much time for cleaning," he said with a wave of his hand. "I've been too busy with the music and the missus." "Where is Leannon? I can't wait to finally meet her." "Oh, she's around. Probably went for a walk or something," he replied rather sadly. "She's glued to my hip when we're on the road, so I don't blame her for feeling a bit scarce when we're home. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, you know." He tried to sound flippant, but I could hear a touch of despair in his voice. I wondered if she was gone a lot lately, and if that's why he sounded so hurt. Trouble in paradise, maybe? We spent the next several hours reminiscing about our childhood and talking about the things he had experienced since moving to Ireland that he didn't want to tell Mom. I noticed that with each hour that passed, energy seemed to drain from poor Todd, slowly but steadily. By 9 p.m., he was ready for bed. I watched him drag his feet along the carpet as he made his way to his bedroom. He hunched over slightly and slid his hand along any surface as he passed, as if he was afraid he would fall. I thanked the heavens that he didn't have any stairs in his house. As I set up the pillow and blanket he gave me on the couch, as I laid down and drifted off to sleep, I guessed that Leannon wasn't coming home that night and wondered where she was staying. My last thought before sleep took me was pity for my brother and determination that I would talk to him about it in the morning. But I'm not sure what time it was when I was jerked awake by the scream, but I felt like I'd been asleep for at least a few hours. I scrambled off the couch, tripping over the blanket that covered me, and rushed to the source of the sound, Todd's bedroom. The scream had been replaced by muffled sobbing while I fumbled my way through the unfamiliar house and bumped into furniture that the dark hid from my sight. When I finally got to my destination, I threw open the door and called out for my brother. I doubt he heard me over the fresh scream that escaped his mouth, and I'll never know if he heard the one that escaped my own. There was a woman on his bed. She was straddling him and bending over so that her fiery red hair concealed his face and hers. Her pale skin gave off a white glow that dimly lit the room. While I couldn't yet see her face, I could hear her feeding on my brother. She sucked and slurped loudly like a child messily eating soup. She stopped a long moment after noticing my presence, slowly raising her head before flipping her curly hair so it landed at her back. After running her slender arm across her mouth, she turned her head to glare at me with shining emerald eyes. I couldn't move. I desperately wanted to run to my brother, to push this beautiful creature off him and carry him away, but I was rooted to where I stood. The woman smiled at me, her plump lips stretching to reveal perfectly straight teeth before she simply disappeared. My heart threatened to pound out of my chest as I fought back the urge to vomit. After a few minutes of standing there trying to steady my panicked breathing and figure out just what I saw, I regained control of myself and turned on the bedroom light. I rushed to Todd, who lay too still in his bed. He was not only dead, but mummified. Any exposed skin was a dark grayish brown, and so dry that it looked like it would crumble if I touched him. His mouth was open in an eternal scream that displayed wood-like teeth and a shriveled tongue. The sheets and blankets around him were still gripped tightly in his bony fingers. I ran from the house, screaming and sobbing like a madman. Perhaps I was mad. How else could I explain this whole thing? I rushed to the nearest neighbor's house and pounded frantically on the door until they answered. I didn't even care about the shotgun that was aimed at my face until they understood that I needed help. The police were called, and I was taken to the hospital. Once I calmed down enough to speak coherently, I told the officer what I'd seen. I thought he'd figure I was crazy, that I'd be locked away in a padded room for the rest of my days. But he just shook his head and gave me a sad look. "Seems your brother met with the fairy sweetheart, lad. Sorry for your loss," he said as he strode out of my room. I was released from the hospital the next day and flew home the day after that. We played songs from my brother's album during his funeral. It helped mask the whispers from people wondering why the casket was closed. I never told my mother exactly what happened and refused to let her see Todd's body. When she asked if Leannon was going to travel to the States for the funeral, I told her I doubted it. I also prayed she would stay the hell in Ireland. A lovely story, my darlings, about one of my favorite Irish creatures. The Liananshi, a vampire who sucks the life out of artists as she poses as their muse and gives them, in exchange for a shortened life, inspiration and fame. So quoth this raven. Fairies by V. Hades. Legend, as you know, is born of duality. History is taken, observed, and understood. It is then shaped by the questions, the fears, and the expectations of those who tell it, sculpted by the human mind and its ability to breathe into a sigh of illusion. Fact and superstition meld into one another, seamlessly as to make it practically impossible to tell which is which. The legend grows with every time it is told, with each word that is not quite the same as it was last portrayed. Its branches curve and reach, ever called by the enlightenment that it seeks. But its roots are deep, visceral, and real. Legend holds more truth than reality. It is far more revealing. I was shaped by stories. I found enchantment in Andersen's Snow Queen. I found fear in Perrault's Bluebeard. My knees have been covered in Cinderella's ashes, and my mouth has tasted Snow White's apple. My heart sank for the little mermaid's fate, and I learned that humans are often the most terrifying monsters. My mother read me a bedtime story every night until I was 8. Call it tradition, ritual. She would tuck me in, sit beside me on my bed, and read. Soft and calm, her words were an unsung lullaby. When she noticed my eyelids fluttering in an effort to stay awake, she'd smile at me, kiss my forehead, and whisper a loving, "Good night, honey. May your dreams be as sweet as you are." The tales didn't end with the coming of my teenage years. They changed and matured with me. From classic fairy tales to urban legends and lore, I still found myself drawn to fable and fantasy. My sanctuary was made up of words, both spoken and written, and they fed my ever-famished imagination. But I was never one for happy endings. Bubblegum pink and cotton candy clouds. I was sadistic in the way I was entertained by hearing about others' misfortunes. I was a masochist in the way I enjoyed feeling my chest clench with sadness and my skin ripple with unease. Humanity is fascinating in the shape taken by its fears. This led me to travel the continent in search of any and all local legends I could immerse myself into. Skinwalkers, Wendigos, the legend of Stull Cemetery. Every story was a stone on which I walked on this strange adventure of mine. But my favorite story has always been right at home, among so many other aboriginal tales tucked away in a forest not 5 miles from my parents' home. The night had been cold, biting and scraping, the bark of the tree and the skin of any who dared poke their noses out of the comfort of their shelters. Families huddled around fires, elders told stories of milder days, and little ones fell into a tranquil sleep, their bellies full of dried meat and beans. There was one soul, however, brave or foolish, that did not care for the warmth of the camp. She did not care for much of anything as she walked through the woods. The frosted tips of grass crackled under her bare footsteps, tears leaving frigid streaks on the corners of her quivering mouth. She needed nothing but the company of her own thoughts. The forest cleared wide, revealing a small, shallow lake. The water was still, shining as brightly as a crystal under the soft lunar glow. The girl sat on a rock looming over the lake and reflected on what had brought her to the edge of despair. She had lost the man she'd loved to war. She had had his blood on her after desperately dragging his body away from the battlefield. It had been 2 weeks, and her clothing was still stained maroon. Her sobs broke through the thick silence. She had never been this cold, inside and out. A bleeding prayer crawled from her quivering lips. "Please, please," she cried. "I need him." But as time passed, the ache grew numb, as did her limbs. Nothing will bring him back, she told herself, and stood prepared to return to camp. She glanced at her reflection, and her eyes locked with those staring back at her. And with a peaceful breath, she let herself fall into the near-freezing water. Though she could swim and could have gotten out, she did not struggle. Death took her easily. The tribe members woke to screams, a child having found her gray, pale body face down in the water. When they pulled her body out, they saw that she was smiling. It is said that her spirit now takes the shape of the fairies, wispy lights dancing around the lake on particularly cold spring nights. My voice faded into the night air, only interrupted by the sound of crackling flames inside the outdoor fireplace in my parents' backyard. My own breath released as my mother shuddered, leaning her bundled-up body into my father's arms. "As much as I like your storytelling, Hazel, this one just sticks with me the wrong way." I laughed, grabbing a bottle of beer from the 12-pack my fiancé and I had brought over. I twisted it open and took a quick sip before replying on the exhale. "This is on you, Mom. As I recall, you're the one who told me that story when I was, 8 years old?" "All I told you was that the lake was called Fairy Lake because a girl died of a broken heart, and that her spirit manifests itself as fairies. Your version is so much darker and detailed." "It's called research, Mother." I rolled my eyes. She glared at me, but we were both smiling. My father, however, did not see that smile and got up from his chair, accompanied by a very specific sound men of a certain age do when they get back on their feet. I patted my fiancé on the shoulder. "I don't know about you, Mark, but I'm going to put another log in the fire. Let him talk this one out." Mark leaned in close to kiss my forehead before following my father to the fire. Striking a conversation about the upcoming fishing trip, I stood and joined my mom, sitting by her side and shifting my body as to be able to lay my head on her shoulder. Despite having been taller than her ever since I was 14, she chuckled and wrapped her arm around my shoulders, our eyes fixed on the fire and the men watching over it. "You're leaving on Sunday morning, right? What are your plans for the rest of the weekend?" she asked, stroking my hair. My fiancé and I visited my parents every few months, our schedules and the 2-hour drive to my hometown being the main reason why we didn't do it more often. I made a point of spending most of that time in their company. Saturdays, however, were usually reserved for outings and catching up with friends. "We have brunch with Tricia, and then—" I trailed off, nibbling my lower lip. Then I raised my gaze to meet my mother's. "You know that blog I write?" She nodded. "Yes, the one about urban legends. What about it?" "Well," I waited patiently for her to put 2 and 2 together. As my smile grew sweeter, hers faded, until I could see the realization dawn on her. She sighed and shook her head, exasperated, but she knew better than to try and stop me. She had always been great about letting me make my own mistakes. I guess it's back to your roots with this one, hmm? Yeah, I figured, I was planning to drop by. And I'm about due to post another blog entry, so 2 birds with 1 stone? I took another gulp of my beer. And you know how much I love that story. That I do. She paused for a moment, her silence telling of her hesitation. Her gaze was fixed into nothingness, and her lips only just parted as though she wanted to speak, but couldn't. The fire popped and brought her back to me from deep within her thoughts. Just be careful, all right? The city hasn't opened the trails going through the park to the public yet. Of course. Always. With hiking gear on and backpacks full of supplies and food strapped to our shoulders, we were ready to leave by 4 in the afternoon, although the walk to the edge of the forest would not be more than 20 minutes long. Getting to the lake itself would take us well into the early evening. "Don't wait up," I called out to my mother, opening the front door, the wooden floorboards creaking under my mother's approaching footsteps. Once she was inside, I continued, "We'll be back tonight, but I'm not exactly sure when." "You crazy kids." She hugged Mark first. "Take care of my daughter, all right?" "I promise, Mrs. Adams." He had been told countless times to call her by her first name, but he still refused. Catholic school will do that to someone. "And you." She held me close and gave my cheek a big, noisy kiss. "Don't do anything stupid." I returned her affection, laughing gently. "You worry too much." "You give me reason to worry." She looked at us both, though it seemed like her mind had wandered to places unknown, before she extended her arm to point outside where the birds were chirping their last songs of the day. "All right, off you go before I decide to lock you in." We stepped out and turned. Mom waved one last goodbye and closed the door behind us. I couldn't help but chuckle, a little nervously, I'll admit. The look on her face was both endearing and slightly concerning. I brushed it off with a deep sigh and a peck on my fiancé's lips. I glanced around and then nodded my head towards the forest. I started walking and he followed closely, our feet enjoying the stable footing of a concrete sidewalk, which we knew we wouldn't have for very long. We didn't speak, but a few minutes into the walk, Mark started whistling the 7 Dwarfs song from Snow White. I giggled, then joined him, my hand reaching out slightly behind me to grab his. There's no one else I would have wanted to do this with. We barely noticed the pavement had ended and turned to soil. Detritus cluttered the ground as we entered the woods. Our song faded, and small branches taken down by the still recent winter crunch beneath our feet. Layers of dead leaves and newly sprouted grass soften our tread. I breathed deeply, the smell of the forest and earth enveloping my chest. Nature was speaking to me, and its voice was hypnotic. This is where I belong, I thought, here with him, sharing this sacred experience. The thought had only just latched into my mind when I felt Mark's arms wrap around my waist, his lips peppering kisses on the back of my neck. I laughed, and the growth of his beard tickled my skin, and let my hand trace the outline of his fingers. "Ready, Freddie?" He spoke calmly. I nodded, turned to kiss the tip of his nose, and started walking again, my feet easily finding the path I had so often stepped upon. I knew exactly where to go, despite being both distracted and entertained by my conversation with my fiancé. Turn right at the clearing, straight past the bog, right again after the fallen oak tree. I had committed this hike to memory, and it came back to me with smooth reminiscence. Time passed, the sunlit path now streaked with pink and orange. Our conversations, which at first were animated and lively, turned to whispers. I didn't press him, but I knew he was here for me. Mark's beliefs and aspirations were welded into reality, and while he saw the cultural quality of stories, his imagination did not need quenching as mine did. I knew he enjoyed the scenery, but that he'd much rather get back to my parents' home and snuggle up in front of Netflix with a bottle of wine to share. And while I silently thanked him for humoring me, I took this moment as my own and let it flow in and through me. I closed my eyes and let my senses guide me. Deep breaths, smelling of chlorophyll and setting sun. Steady, quick steps on earth and stone. The gentle bubbling of a brook. I didn't notice my pace quickening along with the rhythm of my heart. Lungs struggling to keep up. I was walking, jogging, running, eyes closed, shoulders bumping against a tree here and there, but somehow always staying on course. It was pulling me from deep within my core. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I was not strong enough to offer any resistance. I was running like I needed to, like my whole existence depended on the constant rhythm of my feet hitting the ground and the panting of my breath. I opened my eyes 10 minutes later, chest heaving deeply, and face flushed from effort and strain. My lungs screamed for mercy, the tightness reaching across my chest and up my neck. I reached behind me for my water bottle and took 3 desperate gulps, not caring for a second about the liquid trickling down my chin. I put the bottle away and then rested my palms on my knees, staring at the forest ground while waiting for my body to find its way back to normality. My breath caught as something captured my attention. Through the leaves and wildflowers, a light flitted about like a firefly, as if playing hide and seek, creeping, dipping, sneaking. I'd never seen this before. A luminous ball of energy, creating shimmering ripples in any space it occupied, both mischievous and bewitching. I felt my jaw slacken with surprise, lips parted despite my quiet and sporadic breathing. "What the frick?" I whispered. It whispered back. I couldn't understand what it was saying, or even if it was saying anything, but it was speaking. It was not a language I knew. A disorganized amalgam of foreign syllables, gasps and noises without quite being gibberish. Curiosity led my fingers to reach out for it, and when it noticed the gesture, it paused. Nestled against a torn brown maple leaf, it rotated as if to face me, and I swear it did. Even if it did not seem to have a front or back, it floated towards me, a crisp chill crawling up my arm as it moved against my skin. As it grew nearer, its murmurs became speech, though still obscure to me. Louder and louder it grew until nothing. I barely noticed the silence before it was viciously shattered by a crazed, infernal screech. There was nothing but pure anger coming from this unknown oddity, and while it paralyzed me for a moment, its strength and storm made me stumble back. I couldn't stand the cacophony. I had to get away. Now! My palms dug into the earth where I had fallen, and I dragged myself away whimpering until I felt the brittle husk of a tree against my back. Then it stopped. It all stopped. For the briefest moment, I forgot I existed. The shock of the internal whiplash tore a desperate gasp from my throat and a tear from my eye. I clung to the soil under my fingers as if this gesture would bring me back. Back to what? Mark? I looked around frantically, hoping to see my fiancé's silhouette running towards me, his amber eyes locked with mine, arms scooping me up into one of those hugs that always warmed me from the inside out. Part of me also hoped to see the light again. I hadn't gone insane, that I knew, and yet I needed a confirmation of that fact. There was some way to rationally explain what had happened. A trick of the light? A rare species of bug, maybe. My mind trailed off, trying to find a way to explain the phenomenon I had witnessed, my gaze sweeping over the trees surrounding me, as I tried to catch a glimpse of the man I loved. Why on earth had I started running? I called out his name once more, twice more, louder. With every cry, my voice broke further. Panic tightly wound around my neck. "Mark! Babe, please, where are you?" I swallowed back a sob as I got to my feet, struggling to find stable ground. My hands patted my sides and hips, searching for my cell phone. There was a tower not too far away, and I'd no doubt be able to call him. When I did not find it where I had left it, I fell back to my knees and frantically gouged and rummaged the forest floor around me. I sniffled and cried and whispered, near delirious pleas to myself, as the damp soil quickly covered my hands and sucked under my nails. I had to find it. I had to find him. I ached for him. It was nowhere to be found. Its absence was painful. Denial subsided, quickly replaced by bitter defeat. I wiped away the tears and snot from the back of my dirty hand before getting up limply. Nothing of me was stable. My knees shook, my breath staggered, my mind faltered. I was torn between self-preservation and a dread that set deep in my bones. So I froze, sorely aware of my inability to even think properly. My fingers were cold, so much that they had stopped trembling, numbness spreading with every second that passed. I couldn't say how long the lethargy had me trapped within its grip, but the sun had set when I came around. I blinked slowly. Consciousness returned, carrying with it an aching loneliness. I did the only thing I could. I walked aimlessly, and this time with not a care for where I would end up. I wandered, letting myself be distracted by the sounds of the forest, finding comfort in its constant melody, the whistle of the wind, the groaning of aged wood. I took my time and found purpose in every step, despite having no goal in sight. I was alert, yet I had surrendered to whatever fate might have been ahead of me. Not all who wander are lost. The primitive music I had been a passive spectator to quieted as the woodland surrounding me became sparse. I looked up to see the moon, unitedly bright and ghastly. A few dark clouds pressed against the speckled night sky. I breathed in the crisp evening air and felt it tickle my cheeks and chin where tears had purled down. I exhaled one last muffled sob and considered my surroundings. I was there. The moonlit water sparkled under the faint flutter of the breeze. Tiny waves lapped against the rocky bank. Sorrow that had taken root in my chest was soothed by the sight. I'd get out of here, I thought. I could sleep until daybreak and find my way once rested. I stepped forward and walked around the large expanse before climbing onto a rock, towing my mud-soaked shoes off and sitting down. The edge of the boulder was just high enough that my legs hanged above the lake, but my toes could graze the crystalline water. I noticed, strangely enough, that the docile dance of the shining water was getting brighter. The white, Reflective flutters of light became stronger and more constant as they rose from their aquatic prison and floated above the water. Somehow they seemed arrogant and glorious all at once, hovering and rising, until they shattered the night in a blinding, thundering flash. I screamed, shoulders tremoring in sudden fright, and tried to close my eyes, but simply couldn't. I could not stop watching. I could not ease my erratic heartbeat. It was beautiful and terrifying, ecstasy and dismay intertwined. It was all of my fantasies and nightmares wrapped into one moment of unwavering certainty. The legend was true. She had been here. She had cried, as much as I had, I'm sure, and let her broken heart push her into the lake. She had left a part of her spirit here and become a fairy, a creature of earth and sorrow, a seeker of lost souls, and a messenger of verity. I was seeing history and myth with my own glassy eyes, and I felt pure, untainted joy. This is what my existence had been about, my wildest dreams, my most profound ambition, to find fact in the tales that built me. I stood on the thick slab of stone and let the glow embrace me. The orbs flocked towards me. They brought with them fierce gusts of wind, their primal power shaking the very fabric of my universe. Bliss and fear dug their claws into my heart, tearing another wall from my throat as I raised my arms from my sides, chest pulled forth by the unfaltering will of nature. I could feel the fairies everywhere. Their touch was warm. Their voices were comforting, and they seized me in a way I could never have fathomed. They had me. I could not have moved even if I wanted to. The warmth abruptly turned to scalding heat, and the only thing I could hear were hellish shrieks I had experienced earlier in the woods. I felt them ooze into my skin, scorch their way into my mouth and nose before they devoured my mind. I saw the world, the past, the present, the future. I saw the world and its festering wounds. I saw the world and its darkest truths. I saw a young boy being torn away from his sobbing mother, deathly white hands digging into his ever sun-kissed arm. He couldn't have been no more than 4 years old, cheeks still full with youth, the tips of his fingers stained with the juice of freshly picked berries. Through his watery eyes, I could sense unbearable horror and betrayal. I felt his world shatter and his essence die. Those same eyes would turn to gray, cold stone, every bit of humanity beaten out of him by fist and crucifix. There was nothing left of him but rage. I saw filthy, blood-stained walls through barely opened eyelids. I witnessed the world as one would while lying on their side, head pressed against a dirty carpet. My own hands struggled to prop myself up. A faded impression on my finger where my ring should have been. They trembled as they patted the ground around them, only to find relief when they grabbed a used syringe. The needle pressed into a bruised forearm, pierced the fragile skin, and injected a foggy brown liquid into a throbbing, needy vein. It all faded with merciful deliverance. I saw the body of a black man in torn clothes hanging from a tree by the neck. Dozens of people around him, torches and clubs raised against the darkness of the night. His flesh sizzled under the heat of the open flames, and his corpse became no more than a thick, viscous pulp with every hateful hit of the weapons. The heavy, fleshy thuds were quickly drowned out by the haunting chant that resonated between the branches which held the violated carcass. I saw bare women in girls, huddled fearfully against one another, trapped within a cold, dark room. The walls were damaged concrete and brick, and they stank with the smell of something both bitter and sweet. Skin, sweat, fear, and death. Light barely reached the crowd. The shadows reduced it to a swaying, gasping, gray mess. They fell silent when a deep clang resonated around them. They started screaming and wailing when they heard the subtle hiss of leaking gas. Some threw themselves against the door from which they entered, but it would not move. Most scratched desperately at the walls, crying, begging, leaving behind torn fingernails, trails of blood, and barely noticeable white marks on the surface. Eventually, though, they all fell to the ground, and silence returned. And with this, my heart broke. A single breathy sob sang through my throat, and I let myself fall forward, the cold water quickly surrounding me. The fairies showed me how damaged and ruined the world truly is. They showed me how all hope is lost, for myself and for humanity, that there is nothing left for us here but inescapable pain, sadness, and hatred. It is but a question of time until everything collapses. Then nature will take back what it is owed and rebuild what we have desecrated, and there will be no one left to remember our faults. As I lay here, with not a struggle, breathing in the water that embraces and soothes my twitching lungs, I am relieved to leave this all behind. I open my eyes and reach a hand in front of me, fingers running through submerged earth and twirling seaweed. It is far more beautiful than we will ever be. So quoth this raven. Fairy Fruit by Casper McSadden. All the neighborhood kids knew Mrs. McKinley was a witch. It was a playground truth whispered with such conviction and awe that we didn't dare think to question it. Miss McKinley, you know, the witch. Old ladies were supposed to be grandmothers and give out hard candies and sit inside knitting all day, not live alone in decrepit old cottages overgrown with ivy, with only the stray cats and crows for company. And they were definitely not supposed to live in graveyards. Cemetery, my mother would correct me. And she's not a witch. She's the groundskeeper. You wouldn't want anything to happen to Granddad, would you? Still weird to live beside a bunch of dead people, I mumbled under my breath. Never mind, our house was so close I could see the headstones from my bedroom. But kids never like the truth when the truth is too mundane. We wanted to believe Mrs. McKinley would dig up old bones to scry with. Whatever scrying was. That any missing cats had ended up in her cauldron. That she'd eaten the last little boy who dared to wander through her garden. That one especially sparked our imaginations. Every other kid claimed it was their cousin's, friend's, neighbor's brother, whose name always seemed to change with each new telling. Some days it was Jimmy, others it was Tom. Once I swore I heard he was called Harris, but one thin fact always stayed the same. He'd gone into Mrs. McKinley's garden and never come out again. Perhaps it was that pretend touch of danger that tempted us to make a game out of going in. It was Lizzie who suggested the idea. Lizzie wasn't exactly our leader. We didn't need a leader, and we weren't exactly friends. But there's only so many kids your own age within walking distance. Lizzie was one of them, and as the tallest and loudest, her ideas often ended up counting the most. I, like an idiot, spoke up. "What if she catches us? We'll get in trouble." Lizzie barked out a laugh. "What? You scared of the witch?" "No, my mom says witches don't even exist," I spat back. I didn't believe her, but Lizzie didn't need to know that. "Then you've got no reason to go, right?" I bit down on my cheek. Damn it, she tricked me. Either I was scared of a witch or I was scared of a little old lady, and neither was an acceptable option. All I managed to do was get myself nominated. Fine, then. The way I walked down the narrow road to Mrs. McKinley's side of the graveyard, you'd think I was being led to my own execution. Nervous energy fizzled under my skin like lightning in a bottle. As I made myself sick imagining all the hundreds of millions of ways this could go horribly wrong, but it was too late to back out now. If there was one thing worse than a coward, it was a cowardly quitter. The cottage sat on the edge of the grounds, just off the street and right beside the front gates. I suppose it was her duty to lock up at night. Not that it'd do much good. The wrought iron would be easy enough for hoodlums and teens to scale. Liz gave us all a leg up and then pushed herself over in one go. From there, a thin, short hedge was all that separated us from Mrs. McKinley's garden. It was a sprawl of overgrown grass, filled with wildflowers and weeds. Not that it wasn't well tended to in its own way. She clearly liked to grow her own fruit and vegetables. My mouth glistened at the sight of strawberries, and I had to remind myself that food from a witch is probably poison. Lizzie nudged me. "Dare you to grab one." "Why?" She cracked a toothy grin. "You want a trophy, don't you?" I'd have been happy to get out of there with all my fingers and toes and skin still on my bones, but I nodded anyway. Whatever got Lizzie to shut up and get on with it. The buzz of excitement faded away as the group held its breath in anticipation. And then I was running, leaping across the hedge, catching my foot on the way down, my hands in the dirt, pushing myself back up before I had even finished stumbling. Every moment in here was another chance to get caught. I darted across the grass, kicked up dandelions as I went. I needed to grab something, not the strawberries. They were too close to the window. More chance to get eaten. Something else. There! A bush of gleaming, blood-red berries in the far corner. I sprinted towards them. Arms outstretched, grabbed a fistful and turned. I could see Lizzie and the others now, quietly cheering me on. I was so close, so close. My aching limbs loosened up with relief, and then a shadow passed across the window. I stopped dead. Had she seen me? She had to have seen me, but if she saw me, why wasn't she coming out? She should be coming out. "What are you doing? Hurry up!" I was running again, fumbling over the hedge, not stopping until I reached the wrought iron of the fence that marked freedom. I leaned against the flaking paint of the bars, beginning to feel the burn of a stitch in my side. The others crowded around me, howling and hollering, but it all seemed so faint when I could still hear my heartbeat hammering inside of me. Mrs. McKinley had seen me. I didn't know which possibility was worse. A creepy old witch who could curse me, or a little old lady who could tell my parents. We'd walked a little ways away from the graveyard before I made up some excuse about needing to head home. Instead, I circled back to the McKinley cottage. This time I came up to the front path, dragging my feet like stone all the way. The door glided open before I even had a chance to knock. I don't know what I expected when I saw Mrs. McKinley. Of course, I'd seen her before, but never up close, never like a person. Her skin was creased like a well-loved book, and she wore her hair rebelliously long and loose for a woman her age. She wasn't how I imagined her, or thought I had imagined her, but as soon as the image settled in my mind, I couldn't picture her any other way. She looked down at me with cold, curious eyes, and any hope I had that she hadn't seen me fizzled out like a candle. I didn't say anything. I just held out the clump of berries sheepishly. "Sorry," I muttered, wishing I could disappear into the neck of my too-warm jumper. She plucked the clutch of berries from my hand and held them up to the light, inspecting them like a jewelry in diamonds. "Didn't think you'd come back," she said. She slipped the berries into her pocket before eyeing me up and down. "You're Philip's granddaughter, aren't you?" I momentarily forgot my fear. "Your new granddad?" Her face softened into an almost smile. "Only a little. Good man. Always tipped his cap whenever he came to see his wife. Your mother still brings flowers to him every other month." A pang of dread rattled around inside me at mention of my mum. I stared down at my sneakers. "Are you going to tell her? Tell your..." She started laughing, a hearty rasp that reminded me of a cackle of a crow. "Girl, I was never going to tell your parents. Getting sick off fairy fruit would have been punishment enough. But since you brought it back, I think we can call things even." "Fairy fruit?" "The berry." She patted her pocket indicatively. "Makes a person awful sick if it's not properly prepared. You can't eat it off the bush. But it does make a tasty jam. I made a batch the other day. If you'd like to try some." I nodded automatically. Maybe out of politeness, maybe out of fear. I don't know. But that was all it took for her to lead me inside, through the hallway, into a cozy kitchen with gauzy curtains and mismatched crockery lining the walls. This was the home of a witch? I sat myself down at the table, continuing my in-depth analysis of Mrs. McKinley's home decor, until a slice of sponge cake was placed in front of me. It was spread with juice red jam that threatened to trickle down the sides in thick, gleaming globs, if not gobbled up fast enough. Mrs. McKinley took a seat opposite me, folding her hands on the table expectantly. "Enjoy," she said. I lifted up the cake, trying my best to keep my fingers away from the ever-sticky jam, and took a single, cautious bite. And then another, and another, until the generous slice had disappeared entirely. It tasted achingly sweet in my mouth, as smooth and rich as you'd imagine the wildest berry to be, as deliciously forbidden as sips of wine stolen on New Year's. I already wanted more. "You like that?" Mrs. McKinley chuckled. I nodded, licking away a smear of jam that spilled down my chin. A wave of self-consciousness ran across my skin as I tried to recompose myself. "So why is it called fairy fruit?" It's a question that made her eyes light up. She pulled the berries out of her pocket, holding them out for me to see. "See the leaves?" I did. Each one had 5 gangly points, making it resemble a little person with a head and arms and legs. Beware the men who grow from roots and never eat their fairy fruits. Sorry? You don't read much folklore. I gave a soft shrug. Maybe I had a copy of the Brothers Grimm under my bed somewhere, but that was about it. Well, in the old stories, it's bad to eat the food of the Fae. Fairies, that is. The humans that do usually end up getting trapped in fairyland, or eaten themselves. So when people discovered the strange berries that look like little people, make you sick, they simply assumed it was a Fae curse. I nodded thoughtfully. It made enough sense, and then a thought spilled out of my sticky, jammed-up mouth before I could stop it. Do you know a lot about curses? She tilted her head to the side curiously. Now, what makes you say that? Never mind, because you kids all think I'm a witch. I'm pinned to my seat, my face perfectly placid, while underneath I am bubbling with fear. She stares down at me, an unreadable expression, until I realize she's really waiting for an answer. Well, I managed to choke out. Are you? And then she laughs, long and hard, and longer still, until even my relief turns tepid. At least you're an honest girl, she said finally. No, I don't ride a broomstick or dance with the devil or anything like that. I'm just a simple old woman who keeps to herself in her garden and lives in a graveyard. I clamped my hand over my mouth a moment too late. A coy smile worked its way into the corners of her mouth. That too. But don't you ever get creeped out? She gave her head a soft shake. You know, your grandfather was a good man. It'd be strange to think any less of him just because he's in the ground. I stared down at the table. I can feel an unpleasantly itchy pang of guilt crawl up through me. Mrs. McKinley, I'm sorry. You already said that once, girl. Don't say anything you mean more than once. No, not just for the berries. I'm sorry I thought you were a witch. She smiled at me. You'll come say hi whenever you like, dear. I could use the company. Keep your nose clean and I promise I won't curse you. And then she winked at me. I walked home that day a little brighter, a little bolder, and the sweet taste of fairy fruit still lingering in my mouth. I wasn't scared of Mrs. McKinley after that. If I saw her on our way to visit Granddad's grave, I'd give a wave no matter how far away. On some slow days when there was no one to play with, I'd wander over to her cottage and sit in her kitchen a while, learning bits of folklore I'd never find in the books under my bed, and happily eating fairy or fruit cake. She'd tell me more about fairies, real fairies, cruel fairies, not the dainty kind in flower petal dresses found on postcards, about their weakness for iron, the secrets of their names, the way they'd twist the truth into knots on their tongues to make it up for the fact that they can't lie. You'll never get a straight answer out of a fae, she said once. Always dodging questions. Sometimes the words you don't say are more important than the ones you do. I enjoyed that. Little bits of knowledge, however pointless, that gave me more power. A new way to see the world. The cake was nice, too. But what soured the taste was the days I didn't see Mrs. McKinley, when I slipped back into my old patterns and found myself playing with my maybe friends. She didn't come up all that much, but when she did, I took notice of every whisper and snicker and jeer wrapped around her name. She didn't deserve it, any of it. Annoyance started to buzz under my skin like an ugly itch, and it didn't take long for me to scratch it. It was a summery day when the hazy heat was making us bored and sluggish. It was Lizzie who started it, of course. It was always Lizzie. We could see what the mental old McKinley's up to. I heard Janie Davy's cat hasn't come home since. Leave her alone, Liz. She turned to me. What? She's not harming anyone. Let's just do something else. Since when are you scared of the weird old witch? An indignant spark roared up inside of me. I'm not, I muttered. R2. Am not. R. Not. And then an idea snapped into my head. Behind it was a trickle of guilt, but it was easy to drown out under all my anger and pride. Fine, I said. I'll prove it. Without another word, I turned and walked away, down the narrow road to Mrs. McKinley's side of the graveyard, all the while vaguely aware the others were following, bewilderedly behind. There was no hiding this time, no clambering over fences to avoid perfectly fine front gates. I walked right up the front path and knocked, the way I would if I were to visit on any other day. As soon as I thumped my fist on the painted wood of the front door, I heard the scuffling of scattering feet, the group rushing to seclude themselves in the safety of shadows and trees. Mrs. McKinley didn't seem surprised to see me. She never did. For a moment I felt that same flicker of guilt fizzle up inside of me. Here I was, exploiting the unearned reputation I hated for making myself look better. But I couldn't let them call me a coward. Sorry, Mrs. McKinley. Hello, dear, she said brightly. She peered over my shoulder curiously. Are your friends not going to join us? I didn't ask how she knew they were there. I simply slipped inside and let her close the door behind me. A little while later, I emerged from the cottage again, this time carrying a box of fairy fruit cake. For your friends, Mrs. McKinley had said with a wink. As soon as I was past the graveyard gate, I was swarmed, the center of a mass of grasping hands and awestruck eyes. You actually went in there? What was it like? Are you crazy? I tried to give my most casual shrug. I was already struggling to keep the proud grin off my face. There was nothing scary about what I'd done, but they didn't need to know that. My eye caught Lizzie, leaning back against the fence and projecting to the whole world how much she didn't care. I stared up at her. Told you I wasn't scared. She looked at me all dark and stony, her eyes drifting down to the box. What you got there? As if she couldn't see through the clear plastic. Just some cakes from Mrs. McKinley. I gestured to the rest of the group. Want one? Lizzie scoffed. How do you know they aren't poisoned? There was a murmur across the group. A battle between hesitation and temptation. Well, I pried off the lid, reached in, lifted one out to take a bite. I've been eating plenty and I'm not dead, am I? That was enough of an invite. One sticky hand reached in and took a cake, followed by another and another, until everyone but Lizzie had a taste of fairy fruit. Liz, I said, holding out the last one. Her mouth was a tight, thin line as she eyed the cake. What kind is it anyway? Fairy fruit. She grows the berries that make the jam herself. And you think I want to eat witchy food? Fine. I shoved it in my mouth before she had a chance to change her mind. She rolled her eyes and walked away, hands in pockets. But for a second, I thought I saw a twitch of regret in the corner of her mouth. So, Mrs. McKinley said, setting down 2 cups on the table. Tea for her, hot chocolate for me. Did your friends enjoy the cakes? I nodded. Everyone except Liz. She's just so... Ugh! She doesn't want anyone to do anything except what she tells them. It's so annoying. She tilted her head sympathetically. Some people are just immature. She'll never be a grown-up if she doesn't learn to act like one. Cake, dear? I nodded again, maybe a little too vigorously. Mrs. McKinley rose up to retrieve her jam and sponge from the cupboard. I was still sat at the table, sipping my drink and swinging my legs, when a gangly shadow flicked across the window. I shot around to look, a splash of hot chocolate hitting my dress as I turned. The garden was empty, the trespasser gone, but a telltale trail of trampled grass led to the fairy fruit bush and back. I bolted up. Miss McKinley, I think... Leave it, pet. Some people just need to learn a lesson the hard way. The next time I saw Liz, she looked pale, thinner. She didn't seem to tower over the rest of us as much. In the back of my head, I wonder if it was sickness from eating fairy fruit. Good, I thought. That'll teach her. But a day of tiredness and lethargy soon turned into a week. She was speaking less, standing back more, fading from the group like a shadow scattering under cloud cover. Soon there were days where she didn't come outside at all. I asked about it at school once. She shrugged from across the lunch table, too busy pulling the crust off her uneaten sandwich to even look up. Just don't feel like playing much. Getting too old for it, you know. I tried to nod convincingly, sympathetically. I didn't know, not really, but it seemed like a polite thing to do. How come you're not eating? She shrugged again. Just not hungry. Hey, did McKinley give you any more of those cakes? I shook my head and pretended not to see the way her shoulders drooped with genuine dismay. It turned out that there wouldn't be any more fairy fruit for me either. Afraid the plants withered up, pet, Mrs. McKinley told me the next time I came over. She pointed out to the window where the fairy fruit bush once stood. Now there was only a path of empty earth, as fresh as a newly dug grave. Fairy fruit can be fickle like that. I don't even know if it'll be back next year. I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss it, but not as much as Lizzie, I bet. After all, she only got one taste. I never got the chance to tell her, or even time to decide if I should, because that's when she disappeared from school. First it was just a day, then a second, a third, but by the end of the week our teacher announced Lizzie was in the hospital. Something about not getting enough nutrition. We scribbled cards in class and waited eagerly for the return of the bold, brash Lizzie, hopefully with hospital stories and maybe a scar. But the weeks passed into months, and the weather turned gray, and all our morbid curiosity died away as we realized Lizzie wasn't getting better. I went to see her once, just once. In books and stories, they always say sick people look like ghosts. Lizzie didn't look like a ghost. Lizzie looked dead. The girl who once stood like a sunflower in a field of weeds now lay back on bleached white pillow, little more than a gauzy skeleton. Her lips were cracked like crumbling dust, and I could see the blue of her veins pulsing weakly underneath her pale skin. She didn't talk. I don't think she could talk. And maybe that's for the best. What do you say to someone who's obviously going to die? Lizzie didn't make it till spring. She was buried in a grave so far up the hillside I could see it from my bedroom window. I kept my curtains closed for a long, long time. Some months later, when the last of the slush had melted, my mom took me on one of her regular visits to Granddad's grave. She didn't stop me when I slipped away, wandering my way up the hill. I don't know if I wanted to see Lizzie, but it felt like I had to. As I worked my way through the rows of mismatched headstones, a figure came into view, kneeling over a grave, the grave, with gloves and hat and trowel in hand, a figure I now knew even from afar, Mrs. McKinley. "They never tell you about the weeds," she called out as I kept coming closer. She didn't seem surprised to see me. She never did. Good earth makes for good weeds, even when there are bodies underneath. But maybe today we've got something even better. She looked so at ease with her hands in the earth, the new grass not even grown over. As I watched her, I remembered what Mrs. McKinley said about fairy folk, how you'll never get a straight answer out of them. I remember how I asked her if she really was a witch. She gave me a list of all the witchy things she didn't do, but she never said no. With one tug, Miss McKinley pulled something up, a tangle of roots, thin and fine that seemed to go on forever. She wiped the glistening sweat off her brow. "Good news! There'll be plenty of jam this year." My stomach lurched. I could see the head she was holding now, gangly leaves of 5 and blood-red berries not yet ripe, growing right over Lizzie's grave. Mrs. McKinley gave me a dark, knowing smile. "You know, some people think fairy fruit is a bit bitter." She plucked a single berry and popped it in her mouth. "But I think it's the sweetest fruit of all." So quoth this raven.
It's called My Aunt Lucy by Cheese Onion Crisps. My Aunt Lucy was 8 years old, or at least that's how I've always pictured her. She was my mum's older sister, so she'd probably be in her 50s if she was alive today. She was stolen away by the fairies, my grandma told me. They came to her in the woods and played with her. They're ugly, fairies are. So hideously ugly that you'd run away screaming if you set eyes on one. But they can change their form. They dressed themselves in buttercups and put dewdrops in her eyes that distorted her vision. To her, they would have looked like beautiful children. Beautiful children, I gasped. I must have been about 4, but in real life, they'd still be ugly fairies. Yes, with teeth like jagged rocks and skin like tree trunks covered with moss and lichen. Only their eyes would have stayed the same. They'd have been bright red like coals. So they never looked her straight in the face. They told her she was going to a party and asked if she wanted to come. They said it was just across the lake and it wasn't as deep as she thought. They made the deep, murky water look shallow and crystal clear. Then what happened? They took her by the hand and begged her to let them lead her in. They can lead you anywhere, fairies can, but they can't make you go if you don't agree to go with them. So they begged and eventually she said yes. Then what? She took off her shoes and her socks, and the moment her feet touched the water, she was sucked in. Once she was under, the fairies revealed their true shape and true nature. They told her that she couldn't leave, and pricked and pinched her to make her swim down to the bottom of the lake. Why didn't she just stick her head up and shout for help? There was nobody there to hear her. Anyway, when she swam up through the water, she found that the surface was hard as glass. She couldn't go up. She could only go down. She could never go up again. Though I wasn't much of a skeptic at 4 years old, this last bit did give me a bit of pause. "Grandma," I said, "if she never came up again, then how do you know the story?" My grandma's expression blackened. "They told me," she said. "They like to tell me things, like what they did to Lucy.
and what they do to other children like her. Do you know what they did to Lucy? She was shouting now. I leaned away from her, as far as you can lean away from somebody while sitting in an armchair. I probably would have gotten up and run if my feet had been touching the ground. As it was, I burrowed myself into the cushioned backrest and shook my head. They gave her food, she said, glaring at me, as if it were all my fault. She cried and wouldn't take it, so they had to force it down her throat. Then the moment she swallowed it, she froze. She paused, obviously waiting for a response, but I was too busy edging away from her as far as possible. After a few seconds, she just carried on regardless. Yes, she froze. Her heart stopped beating, her eyes stopped seeing, her lungs stopped breathing, her ears stopped hearing. You mean she died? I whispered. No, she said. She seemed to regain her composure. At any rate, her voice went back to its normal volume. Not died. Her body stopped, but her brain didn't. She's still down there, they tell me, still fresh as a daisy. Her hair had been growing all this time, they tell me, and her nails, and she's still awake inside. She wants to leave. Her voice started rising again, louder and more excited with every syllable. She wants to leave, but they won't let her go! The 3 words were said as a scream. The noise made me burst into tears and sent my mother running into the room. She picked me up, hugged me, and carried me out of the room, away from my grandma, who was shrieking and writhing in her chair like an animal. From then on, I was only taken to see my grandma very rarely, though my mother went every week. I was never left alone with her again. For a while after that, until I was around 9 years old, I was plagued by recurring nightmares about strikingly beautiful children that morphed into horrible, bat-skin monsters and tried to drag me into the lake. In my dreams, my grandmother's stories about fairies not being able to lead you where you didn't want to go were wrong. They pulled me down feet first until I was up to my neck in it. Then I would wake up, often soaking wet from what I always thought, for a few desperate seconds, was lake water. But as I grew up, the story started to lose its power over me. I stopped waking up screaming in the night. I was 9 years old. I was too big to be afraid of stupid fairy stories. In fact, I started retelling it. In the playground, as sleepovers, round the campfire, when we went on a residential school trip. I became famous for it. People would beg me to tell them that freaky story with the fairies. And if they didn't believe it, they could always come round to my house and see the faded photograph on the mantelpiece of a pretty little girl with blue eyes and brown pigtails. It was when me mum caught me on one of these little tours that I finally heard the true story of what happened to my Aunt Lucy. She walked in on me and a group of friends passing around the photographs while I told them the story. I stopped in mid-word when I saw her walk in. Though I'd long ago stopped believing in my grandma's stories, I was well aware that something had happened to my mum's older sister, and it probably wasn't anything good. My mum ordered all my friends out of the house. I remember that I half wondered about sneaking out with them, but I was smart enough to know that I wouldn't have gotten away with it. Then, when they were all gone, she sat me down next to her on the sofa, and I prepared myself for the oncoming lecture and or grounding. Instead, she started telling me the real story of what happened to my Aunt Lucy. My grandmother and grandfather, who died before I could meet him, lived in a cottage at the end of a village by a wood. It was in the 1960s, back when it was normal to let your kids wander around for miles as long as they didn't walk on people's flower beds, and came home when it got dark. Mostly the kids in the village just played football on the green and ran up and down the lanes. Through hedges and in and out of people's back gardens. Occasionally, though, they'd go down to the woods. Then, one day, my Aunt Lucy didn't come home. At first, my grandparents were just angry. My mum was sent down to the village to find her and tell her what dire punishments awaited her when she got home. But she wasn't in the village, and after a few hours, anger turned to worry and my grandfather went out with a torch to check the woods. He came back, crying and clutching the bright red Mary Jane shoes that had been bought for Lucy in town the weekend before. My mum remembered being jealous of those shoes. So jealous that for weeks after she walked around feeling guilty, convinced she was somehow responsible for her sister's death. The shoes had been found by the lake, along with a pair of white cotton socks. It was pretty clear what had happened. Lucy had gone in for a paddle, or maybe just to dip her feet, and had slipped and drowned. People said, when they'd forgotten that my mum was still in the room, that it was only a matter of time before she bobbed back up again. She didn't, though. She stayed under. Probably she got tangled in some weeds or something, my mum said, and shortly after my grandma started saying that the fairies got her. My grandfather had her committed, and she started saying she could hear them talking to her. I stopped telling the story after that, but years later I became interested in it again. After some intense Googling, I found the newspaper that had reported her death. "Local girl drowned" was the headline, and the picture below it was, eerily enough, a copy of the same one that still sat on my mum's mantelpiece. The name of the village was there too, and I wondered about going there, just to have a look around. But a second later I decided against it. I've always been a bit morbid. Even I had my limits, and driving several miles to a village in the middle of nowhere just because a girl died there was one of them. Or so I thought anyway. The idea gnawed at me, you see, niggling away at the back of my brain. I found myself casually, just out of curiosity, going on Google Maps to see just how long exactly it would take me to drive up to the village, and typing the postcard into my new sat-nav, just to see if the destination matches up with Google Maps. It took a week for me to finally give in, but give in I did, and that weekend I drove down to the village, just so I could learn more about my family history. I wasn't fooling myself one bit, not really. The woods were smaller than I expected. My mother had made them sound huge and so thick that you couldn't see through them for the trees. Like the sort of woods you'd find in the Grimm's fairy tales. Instead, they were actually quite nice, full of golden sunlight that flowed freely through the gaps between the trees. As I walked, I wondered whether my mum's imagination and the childhood trauma she had connected to them had made them loom larger in her memory, or whether the woods really had been that big, and the trees had just been cut down to make way for more houses. As it was, it took only about 10 minutes to reach the lake, which lay in the centre. This was more like it. The lake was wide, about 5 meters across, probably not quite big enough to qualify as a proper lake, but big enough that you could see why it had earned the nickname. There didn't seem to be anything in it. No ducks dabbling by the shore, no fish swimming close to the surface, and the water was still and black. You could easily picture a child falling in here and never coming up again. I almost thought I saw a pair of red shoes and white cotton socks waiting by the shore, or heard the faint sound of childish giggling. My ears pricked up. I could hear giggling. I looked around, and a small laughing face popped up behind the tree. A little boy, couldn't have been older than 10, with stunning golden blonde curls and cute chubby cheeks. A girl appeared next to him, peeping out shyly through some branches. "Hello," she said. "Hello," I said back. I looked around again. "Are your parents anywhere about?" They both burst into fresh giggles like I'd just made the funniest joke in the world, and the girl stepped forward, revealing long, silky, raven black hair that framed a perfectly sculpted little face, with cheekbones to die for. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Just taking a walk," I replied, deciding that it all started when my aunt was stolen by fairies, was not a great way to begin a conversation. She nodded, and she and the boy walked away from the trees and stood beside me on the muddy shore. "It looks very deep," the boy said. Then, and as if he was telling me an important secret, "There's a skeleton down there." I looked at him in surprise. "What?" "There's a skeleton," the girl said. "It floated up one day. We haven't told the grown-ups about it." She put one of her hands in mine and pointed with the other. "Just over there." Over there was a bit of the lake that was covered with low-hanging branches of a nearby tree. "It's in the water," she said. "You can see if you paddle over." The boy took my other hand and stepped in to demonstrate. The water only came up to his ankles, and I noticed for the first time that his feet were bare. The girl stepped in after him, shedding the dainty slipper she wore on her feet. "Come on, miss," the boy said eagerly. "We haven't told anyone else. You're the first one. Please." "Please," the girl echoed. "Please come and see it. It'll only take a minute. Please." I nodded without thinking about it. Of course I'd go and see the children's skeleton. It would only take a minute. I bent down to take off my shoes, and that was what saved me. As I bent down, my head came level with the little girl's, and it was then I saw what kind of eyes had sat in that pretty little face. They were bright red, like burning coals, and as I looked into them, the skin around them seemed to turn to bark, all covered with moss and lichen. The grips on my hands tightened, and they started to pull me in. Luckily, I think they'd underestimated my strength. The last person they tried this on was 8 years old and willing, after all. I was a grown woman and absolutely terrified. It didn't take long for me to shake them off. I woke up on the side of the lake, soaked with what I'm very glad to say was lake water. There was a man standing over me. Apparently he'd been out walking his dog and heard me scream. People said I was in shock, and I found it easier to just go along with them. No, I didn't really believe I saw fairies. I simply slipped and fallen into the lake. I thrashed around for a bit and screamed before I managed to swim to the side. Then I'd fainted and had a weird dream until that nice man had found me. The shock had caused me to wipe it from my memory. I told them what they wanted to hear, and they stopped bothering me. Who knows? Maybe they were right. Maybe the whole thing was just a very vivid dream. That's what I'd like to think. Only one thing prevented me from agreeing with them and forgetting the whole thing. When the fairies were dragging me down into the lake, or rather, when I dreamed that the fairies were dragging me down into the lake. For a second, just for a second, I swear that the water cleared. Suddenly, I could see right down to the bottom of the lake. I'd been right when I thought that there was nothing in it. I still couldn't see any fish or crabs or anything. No weeds either. Just smooth pebbles all along the bottom. The whole place would have been totally empty if it weren't for the girl. She stood on the bottom, her feet poised to push against the pebbles, her hands helplessly reaching for the daylight. She was wearing a blue gingham dress which swayed around her legs with the rhythm of water lapping at the shore. Her long fingernails grew in spirals around her upreached hands, and her long hair floating around her face like a lion's mane. Her face, even when it was twisted in a look of terror, was still easily recognizable as the face from the photograph that me and my friends had passed around with our grubby little hands. In the split second before I finally got free of the strange children, and the water was once again clouded over in the murk, I swear her eyes moved. Thank you for joining me, my darlings, and I apologize for the accent.
A story for you. This one by Elena Rita, entitled A Haunted Fairyland in Trosa, Sweden. Y'all have a little obsession, right? Maybe it's with a video game or a show or a style of clothing. It might even be a person, or maybe more than one person. But what if these people don't exist? What if you take your obsession with them to a fatal level? That's what happened to my little sister, Lilita. My older brother, Erling, and I are too old to believe in fairies and magical princesses. He'll be off to college in a few months, while I'm just barely 15 years old. Lilita, however, is a completely different story. She's 11, so even she should be old enough to know that she is not a fairy princess. Notwithstanding, she still walks around in a puffy princess dress and fake fairy wings strapped to her back, saying she's a fairy princess. She even pretends to talk to fairies. Our parents aren't ready to tell her that they don't exist, nor will they let Erling and I break the truth to Lilita. I just don't understand why she's allowed to have such childish beliefs. Anyway, our parents woke up early one Sunday morning and left a note on the kitchen table saying that they'd be gone all day to run errands. Great, I grumpily muttered. Now Erling and I have to babysit Lilita. Let's hope she's in a quiet mood today. I opened the refrigerator to find there weren't many breakfast options other than leftover kanelbulle, or Swedish cinnamon rolls. I put them in the microwave for a moment and a half, and when I turned around, I saw a small wooden box on the kitchen counter. I stared at it for a moment. That's rather strange, I thought. That wasn't there before. Curious to know what was inside of it, I slowly reached for the box. I tried to carry it with both hands, but it was rather heavy for something so small. Maybe there was something dense inside of it. I opened it only to be in utter shock by what I saw. It was a small, bloodied person wearing a ripped-up Victorian-style dress and black boots. She had long, straw-like blonde hair, and she was so skinny that the pale skin on her looked eerily tight. Her eyes were closed, and she looked as though she'd been stabbed in multiple places. The strangest part about this was that she had fairy wings. I screamed out loud and stepped back. It was then that I accidentally tripped on a large nail sticking out of the old wooden floors. I fell to the ground and hit my head on the wall. Once again I screamed, but in pain rather than fear. I shook nervously as I heard quick footsteps speeding towards the kitchen. Next thing I knew, there was Erling, was peering at me from behind the counter, not even noticing the box. He ran over to me and crouched down. "What's wrong?" he frantically asked, putting his hand on my back. "I heard you screaming, and then I heard a loud noise. The box on the counter," I muttered. He stood up and looked at the box. He jumped up in surprise at whatever the thing was. "What the hell?" he asked, sweeping his long blonde bangs from his face. "Where did that come from?" "I don't know," I shouted. "It just appeared out of nowhere." He stared at me for a moment. Then he looked at the hallway with a distraught expression. "There can only be one explanation for this," he said, leaving the kitchen. He shouted, "Lilita, you've got some explaining to do." I stood up, trying to ignore the box. I wiped the dust off my clothes as the microwave started beeping. I sighed with relief. It was about time I got something in my stomach anyway. I was halfway through a kanelbulle when Erling came back into the kitchen. His ice blue eyes were watering, and sweat was dripping all over his pale face. That and his expression made him look like he had just watched a gruesome horror movie. "Is everything all right?" I asked, taking a bite of kanelbulle. "I can't find Lilita anywhere, Esther," he groaned. I stopped chewing and dropped the bread. As I swallowed, he gave me the most panic expression ever. "Please don't get mad at me," he whispered fearfully. I won't, but we need to find her, I said, standing up. Did you check her room? Yes, she wasn't there, but her window was open. I sighed. Then she probably crawled outside looking for her make-believe fairies or whatever. I wouldn't necessarily call them make-believe anymore, Erling responded. He gestured over to the box. I was still too scared to look at it again. I started. I wanted to say it was fake, but something about it made me think that it wasn't. Was it the details of the bony structure it had? Or was it how the blood smelled metallic, just like real blood did? Nevertheless, I began to walk down the hallway. Fine, let's just get this over with. Erling followed me to Lilita's room. I opened the door, only to see that everything was a mess. Her blankets and pillows were strewn all over the floor, and so were her Barbies. One of the pictures she had hung on her wall was even tilted. The open window was on the other side of the room. Great, we have to go through this, I grumbled. Yep, Erling sighed. Come on, let's go. We tiptoed through the room, trying not to step on anything. What felt like an eternity later, we finally made it to the window and climbed out. The overgrown, vibrant green grass felt very strange against my bare feet, especially since it was covered in morning dew. But I ignored it. Erling and I ran to the front yard and then down the street. Trosa is a small town in Sweden. It's basically stone roads, rivers, fields, and buildings that look like they belong in the late 19th century. It's also not a very big town, with just over 5,000 people in it, so it's not uncommon for people to know at least 1 to 2/5 of the town. This we could use to our advantage. Have any of you seen Lilita Bergstrom? She's our sister. She's gone missing, Erling and I repeatedly shouted. At first, people would either just shake their heads at us or stare for a moment and turn away. I was already beginning to lose hope. Mom and Dad were going to kill us when they got home. What if they saw us right now? Oh, I could only imagine their reaction when they found out that we hadn't even babysat Lilita for an hour and she already disappeared. But our luck quickly turned around when a thin woman approached us. She had thinning black hair and wrinkled skin, and she was almost as tall as Erling. I might have seen her roaming around here a minute ago, the woman said, but I can't quite say it was her. What does she look like? Well, she has dark brown hair, Erling said. So do a lot of 11-year girls in this town, I teased. Oh, would you stop it, Erling laughed, and then turned serious again. Anyway, she has green eyes and fair skin, and she's very petite. The woman stroked her chin with her finger and thumb. Erling and I anxiously stared at each other, waiting for the woman to answer. If it helps, she was probably dressed up as a fairy, I added. I guess I did see her, the woman called out. Then she pointed to the right. I believe she's over to the beach. Thank you very much, Erling and I said simultaneously. The woman nodded as we went our separate ways. Once we made it to the beach, we began running around calling Lilita's name. There were people everywhere. Families, couples, friends throwing parties. But no Lilita. The further we ran, the more afraid I got. Do you think that woman screwed us over? I asked Erling. I would hope not, he answered. Just then we passed a couple of trees. I stopped and looked at them for a moment. Noticed there was a pair of feet in pink slippers with white tights sticking out of them. I knew immediately it was Lilita. Hey, what are you staring at? Erling called out, staring at me from a distance. I found her, I responded. He ran over to me and I pointed at the shoes. Erling smiled. That's definitely her, he said. We walked over to her. Once we were a good feet away from her, I could hear that she was crying. That couldn't have been good. When we approached her, we saw she was sitting down, crying hysterically. There was no sign of her being hurt, which was fortunate enough. Now we just needed to figure out what was making her so upset. Erling crouched down and put his arms around her.
Everything's all right, Lolita. No, it's not, Lolita cried out. What happened? I asked. They went away, Lolita whimpered, pointing to a horde of trees behind her. Who are you talking about? Erling inquired, letting go of Lolita and standing up. The fairies, Lolita answered. She wiped her tears and continued. I saw a bunch of fairies outside my window, so I climbed out and chased them around. But they were too fast. I couldn't keep up with them anymore. I just wanted them to be my friends. Erling and I stared at each other with guilty expressions. Lolita had been right all this time, yet the two of us had been laughing behind her back for so long. Geez, we're the best siblings ever. But our chance for making it up came when Lolita asked, Esther, Erling, will you help me look for them? We nodded. Lolita smiled wildly and hopped up. We followed her into the forest. Around us were little specks of light floating around like fireflies. For a while we thought we could see small animals like squirrels running around. The more we walked, the more scarce the fauna of the woodland became. Instead, tiny little wooden houses with thick glass windows began to appear on the trees, one by one. I think we found the neighborhood, I added. You don't say, Erling retorted. I lightly punched his shoulder. Suddenly, something fell from one of the trees, landed with a relatively quiet noise. We took a closer look, only to see it was an oversized swallow. Its eyes were closed, its beak was open, and it had a gaping hole in its breast, with blood pouring out of it. Oh, poor thing, Lolita whined. We took a few steps closer to it. Just then the bird opened its eyes, which were all white. Its head did an entire 160-degree turn. Lolita screamed and hid behind me. Erling and I just grazed at the bird as it began to fly up with its head still facing the other way. The bird screeched the most ear-piercing noise ever and flew into a nearby tree where it exploded into a bloody mess. I gagged as all the innards fell to the ground. What the hell was that all about? I screamed. We may never know, Erling said fearfully. Lolita, are you sure you want to do this? Lolita nodded her head, but I could tell she was afraid. Her eyes were still watering as she was shaking, but alas, she walked forward, and we followed. Deeper into the forest, the little specks of light in the air grew bigger and brighter. Eventually, those weren't the only things that were flying around us. We began to see some of the fairies Lolita was talking about. They were all no more than 8 inches tall, and they all wore Elizabethan or Victorian-style dresses, just like the one I saw in the box earlier. They had long flowing hair, thin structures, and pretty faces. No two fairies had identical pairs of wings. They all either looked like they belonged to various birds, butterflies, or different kinds of bugs. The sight was so fascinating and surreal, I still couldn't believe I had ridiculed Lolita. Lolita, where did she go? Erling, I shouted, panicking. He jolted up from what seemed to him daydreaming and stared at me with great concern. What? He screeched, and then looked around. He frowned. Shit, we lost her again, he growled. She can't have gotten too far this time, so there's that, I sighed. Out of nowhere, I heard a blood-curdling scream that sounded far away, but it was still clear as day. My heart sank, at first thinking it was Lolita, but then I took a moment to process the sound of the voice. That didn't sound like my little sister. The voice sounded like a grown woman. I'm just wondering if we should go find Lolita or help that person, Erling mumbled. Like what would be more... Let's just go, I hollered, running forward. I didn't care how far behind Erling may or may not have been. I just wanted to get out of that creepy forest already. But I had to find Lolita. even if I saw the dead corpse of whoever was screaming. Making sure that everyone was safe and getting home before our parents did was worth being scared for life. I had already seen some disturbing things today. Anyway, what was one more? I skidded across the sandy and bark-covered ground, almost tripping over myself. I stopped myself with one foot in the air and one hand gripping onto a large twig. After taking a second to regroup, I stood up dazed. After taking a deep breath and looking at my surroundings in a complete daze, I stopped, only to see a rather frightening thing in front of me. A young woman, most likely the one who screamed, was lying on the ground. Her ice-blue dress, made of silk, was covered in blood, and so was her fair-skinned face. She had bite marks all over her skin. Her eyes, which looked like it was dyed white, was extremely withered and dirty, and her blue eyes were bloodshot and watery. "What happened to you?" I asked. She slowly sat up, shaking and struggling. I offered to help. As she shook her head, she pointed behind me. I turned around, and to my horror, I saw Lolita clenching her fists, which were covered in blood. She also had blood all over her mouth. "Lolita, what did you do to this lady?" "She didn't think these fairies were real," Lolita growled in a deep voice. "She doesn't believe in the power of fairies." I tried to find something to say, but I couldn't seem to find any clever words. "Esther, my dear sister, did you really think I left just to play with the fairies?" Lolita continued. My eyes felt strained, and so did my cheeks. I could feel my head and my heart pounding simultaneously. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. Had Lolita secretly been doing murderous shit behind everyone's back? "I've known Lotta here for quite a while now." Lolita spoke angrily, still in the deep voice that was continuously getting scarier. "Lotta once told me that fairies don't exist, that they were just some made-up entities in children's stories. Well, even when I tried to prove her wrong by leading her into the forest, she thought it was all fake. I couldn't take it anymore, so now I have to kill her." "No, please don't do it," Lotta screamed at the top of her lungs. "This is your consequence, you filthy non-believer." Lolita laughed satanically. "I'm sure you'll make a nice meal for all the fairies." "Stop this nonsense already," I snapped. "I'll call Mom and Dad and they'll be mad at you." "You really think that scares me into stopping?" Lolita chuckled. "Now get out of my way, Esther. Don't make me sacrifice you to the fairies as well." "Please help me, Esther," Lotta whispered. Impulsively, I took Lotta by the hand and ran away from Lolita. Lotta was crying hysterically. "It will be okay, Miss Lotta," I tried to coax her. "You get out of here and take you to the nearest hospital." "Thank you very much," Lotta murmured, smiling faintly. "You're a very nice person." "Don't think you can get away from me," I heard Lolita yelling. "Leave us the hell alone, you psycho," Lotta hollered, trying to run faster. But my legs were getting tired, my lungs were in pain, and I was taking short, quick, and fearful breaths. How long would I have to run before Lolita would leave us alone? I felt a heavy weight on top of my back, and it was so forceful that I fell to the ground. Before I could get up, I felt two hands grab me by the neck. Lolita. She was strangling me as if her life depended on it. I gasped for air, trying to crawl away from her, but she was sitting on top of me, and it was almost impossible to move. "Stop it, please," Lotta begged distraughtly. Lolita didn't respond. I managed to whisper, "You, Lolita, if I manage to make it out of here alive, I'm disowning you as my sister. You can seriously go yourself." Lolita chuckled loudly. "Well, I know you won't survive, so I don't need to worry about that." I shuddered, and still spluttering and struggling for air before the world went black. I managed to give Lolita the finger. I woke up in my bed. I inhaled deeply and looked around the room. Erling was sitting in the beanbag next to my bed. "Good, you're awake." He sighed with relief. He'd been sleeping for a couple of hours. "What the freak?" I croaked. "What the actual freak just happened? Had I been dreaming all that shit?" "No, it was all real, fortunately," Erling uttered. "But everything is all right. You suffered no major injuries. I saw everything that happened with you, Lolita, and that lady. I called the cops and then our parents. Lolita's been sent to a mental facility." I looked down at my lap. My sister was a freaking maniac. There's no other way to put it. I just can't believe she would strangle her own sister and try to eat someone. Multiple thoughts were running through my head regarding the situation. How did our parents react to this? Will I ever see Lolita again? Will she get the help she needs? Did Lotta end up surviving? Erling held my hand, as if reading my mind. "Lotta is fine, and our parents are okay. They're just glad we made it out alive." "That's good, I guess," I mumbled, not sure what else to say. "Also," Erling added, "all those fairies we saw were fake. They were mechanical dolls that can fly up to 50 feet in the air when you press a button on them." I blushed, feeling embarrassed for thinking that they were real. So I was right then. Fairies are really non-existent after all. "Ah," I said, "but what about the bloody one in the box?" "I have no idea what that was about," Erling said. "But it's gone now. I threw it into the fireplace. I'm happy we're all going to be okay, though. Mom and Dad made your favorite lunch, American food. Why don't you get some more rest and then come downstairs to eat?" "Sure thing," I answered. Erling nodded and left my room. Now that I wasn't dead, I couldn't disown Lolita as a sister like I said I would. But something was still off. What drove her to be like this? What made her love fairies to such an extent she would kill anyone who didn't believe in them? I guess I'll have to figure that out for myself. So quoth this raven.
I don't have a fancy profession, but I did meet some fairies once. By adept consideration. When I was little, we used to live near the woods. I spent the vast majority of my time there. Any time I needed to escape my house, which was often back then, I would run into the woods. To me, it was a magical place filled with wonders. I found all kinds of little creatures and treasures. I even found a good place to hide. My favorite place to hide was a felled tree. The inside was hollow. It was so big I could stand up inside of it, and it felt endless. Because it was my favorite place, I hid all my treasures there. Everything I ever found on my adventures went into that hollow. I also brought some books and a flashlight, as much bedding as I could sneak away, and snacks. It was my haven. As I got bigger and things got worse at home, I found myself hiding inside my hollow more often. Sometimes I would even spend the night. You'll think I'm crazy, but I swear that hollow grew right along with me. It didn't matter how tall I got. I was always able to stand inside. It seemed to grow longer, too. When I was older, braver, and bored one night, I decided to see how far it went. I walked for what felt like hours, and I never reached the other side. Instead, I found the village. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever encountered in all my time in those woods. The little structures were stone, and the entire village sat on a bed of moss. Each house was unique and had intricate designs etched on the stones.
I had to get down on my hands and knees to make out the little patterns carved along the stones. I noticed that there were curtains in the windows. Some of the houses even appeared to have fires burning inside. My face was next to one of the little chimneys, and I sneezed as a wisp of smoke curled its way up my nostrils. When I finished wiping my eyes, I saw a little face peering from one of the windows. It looked awful. The skin was gaunt, giving it an emaciated appearance. The color was off as well. It resembled an old bruise with splotches of purple and green. The eyes gave off a yellow sheen and were bloodshot and bulbous. I shuddered when I looked at the thing. I found myself wondering what kind of person had made the village, and I wondered why they made the creatures look so hideous when everything else was so stunning. I looked away then, turning my focus to the little tiles that made up the roof. I ran my finger along the surface and thought about which doll I could bring to play there. As I got lost in thought, planning out which doll would live there, I felt a sharp sting in my elbow, like someone had pricked me with a needle. Upon inspection, I discovered the little person from the window was now standing in the yard. It held a sharpened little tool in its hand and was waving at me angrily. Now, I was 10 years old, which is far too old to believe in monsters and fairies. Still, this little thing looked exactly like a grotesque fairy to me. It had a set of ragged, transparent little wings, though it had just stabbed me, and looking at it made me feel sick to my stomach. I found myself worrying whether it was sick. It kind of reminded me of my Uncle Rob. He had stayed with us for a few months when I was 6. He was sick, and my mother had told me he was going to die soon. I'm positive my parents had let him stay so they could use the checks he was getting. This little thing looked a lot like Uncle Rob had before he died, starving and exhausted, but still trying to fight. It had stopped brandishing its little weapon at me, but was regarding me with a look of suspicion. I held my hands out in the universal sign of peace, which it met with another sharp jab to my palm. The weapon dug in deeper this time, and the creature's eyes lit up as blood dripped down the handle. I watched, more than a little disgusted, as it lapped the blood from the weapon, and then eyed me expectantly. Some of you will think I am insane for doing what I did next, but I couldn't help myself. I was a lonely kid who had hidden in the woods for the majority of my life, and I saw an opportunity to make a friend. It didn't matter to me that at that moment who or what that friend was. I squeezed at the puncture wound until I had gathered a little pool of blood in my palm. Then I extended my hand and let it drink. When it finished, it looked a bit better than it had before. The color of its skin still resembled that of a bruise, but it didn't look quite as starved as it had moments ago. The eyes were no longer glossed with that sickly yellow color. Instead, they shined a brilliant gold. It made its way up my arm and closer to my face then. I watched with curiosity as it pricked its little finger and held it out to me. "No, thank you," I politely declined. "I don't eat blood." It kept waving its finger at me, growing more agitated with each refusal. I didn't want to make it angry again, so I finally bent down and licked the blood from its finger. I tried not to think about the possible diseases as I swallowed and gave it a half-hearted smile. "Not as bad as you thought it would be, is it?" The voice was that of a boy. He was staring up at me, a huge grin plastered on his face. Although his teeth were small, they were razor sharp. His mouth seemed filled with them. I sat there in stunned silence for a moment, trying to collect my thoughts before I spoke. All that came out was a blundered "ah." How? I drank from you and you from me. You have the blood of the Fae now, so we can understand one another. He had traveled back down the mossy area and was sitting there, waiting for me to respond. I couldn't come up with anything that resembled a coherent thought at the moment, so I sat there in stunned silence. You seem nice enough for a giant. He held eye contact with me as he spoke, and I got lost for a moment in those shining eyes. I expected you to tear down our village, so thank you for not doing that. I'm not a giant. I giggled at the notion. I'm a regular person. I don't know why you would think that about me. Your village is beautiful. I would never tear it down. You look like a giant to me. The statement was matter of fact. Giants destroy things. How long have you lived in this tree? I finally gained enough composure to get a decent question out. That was the first one that came to my mind. My family has lived here longer than you would be able to comprehend. My mother told me that our ancestors migrated here for shelter from the giants. When they began to take over our land, this tree appeared. It has kept us safe ever since. Somehow it made sense to me that the tree presented itself when these little beings were in need. I felt that it had done the same for me. Why do you look so sick? Is that how everyone looks here? It didn't occur to me until after the question slipped out that it was a bit rude. We are forced to stay in the hollow, to stay safe from the giants. We need the sun to thrive, and there is no sun here. All our livestock have perished, and we have no light to grow crops. We live much longer than the giants, but their numbers are greater than our own. Our ancestors thought we would outlast them, but they reproduced like rabbits. There are always young ones to take the place of those who die. He was looking up at me, a sadness creeping into his voice. My village will most likely die here, wasting away to nothing while your kind destroys what is left out there. It occurred to me then that I was, in fact, one of the giants. This fairy was talking to me about humans. Its people were stuck here in the dark of my hollow, while mankind ran amok outside. I'm sorry to hear that. I honestly was. I thought about the tales I had read as I looked at the little village. I wondered how many creatures humanity has doomed to extinction with their greed. I had seen the behavior firsthand in my own household. It was what caused me to hide. My parents' addiction had eaten away at them. Their behavior grew worse with each passing year. They were violent and hateful. Their greed grew to such an extent that their next fix came before all else. I couldn't even make friends at school because we had no water at home to bathe or wash my clothes in. I probably looked as disgusting to this creature as it did to me. Is there anything I can do to help your people? I have snacks hidden away in my special spot. I don't know if you'll like them, but I can bring you some to try. We need meat to survive. Meat and blood. Our young drink the blood, but as we grow, we have to have the meat as well. Could you bring us some? The golden shimmer was starting to drain from his eyes. They were taking on that dull yellow sheen again. Well, I guess I could bring you something from our freezer. We may have some hamburger in there. I don't know, though. It's been a while since my parents have gone to the store. My own stomach started to grumble as I spoke, reminding me that it was getting close to sunset. It has to be something fresh. I realized what he meant then, and I grimaced a little. I'd have to kill something and bring it back to them. Do you have something you could collect some of my blood in? I can try and trap something for you, but if you have babies here that need food, I could leave you some behind. I didn't like the thought of cutting myself again, even though the wound was small. I also didn't like the thought of babies going hungry, and that won out over all else. I knew what it felt like to starve, and I couldn't bear to let them go hungry if I could help. He ran around the back of his cottage and came back soon enough with 3 micro-sized wooden buckets. "These are all I have right now." He laid them out in front of me. I took the tool and dug at my finger, squeezing out enough blood to fill each of the buckets. Then I let him drink a little more. When I pulled my hand away, his eyes were shining that golden hue. "I'll try to come back tonight with something else for you. What's your name, by the way?" "It would be easiest for you to call me Faye." He grinned at me as I stood to leave. "I will tell my people not to fear you. You are kind for a giant." "Thanks, Faye." I smiled back and then took off down the path. My encounter with the fairy left me feeling lighter than I had felt in a long time. It wasn't every day I could do something good for someone else. Still, I didn't like the thought of killing an animal. I knew there was no way around it, and I tried to focus on the good it would do for the village. When I reached my house, I found my little brother Dylan crying in his playpen. Both my parents were strung out on the couch. Luckily, it was Saturday, so I didn't have to worry about missing my school bus. I picked him up and cleaned him up. His diaper had split open because it was so full. Then I scavenged the kitchen until I found some cereal and fed him. I felt sorry for him, being born into our family. Honestly, Dylan was the only reason I hadn't run away. I couldn't lug an infant around with me if I took off, and I would have felt like a monster if I had left him behind. Had it not been for me, he probably would have starved to death or smothered by our stupid parents by that point. Neither of them could stand to hear him cry. They always got so angry when he would wail. After I finally got him back to sleep, I searched the house for the gun my dad kept stashed around the house. I knew he had one because he was prone to threatening my mother and me when he was angry. His favorite thing to use during those times was the gun. He would wave it in our faces, gloating that he could shoot us at any moment. At the time, his gun seemed like the best option to catch something for Faye. I had no idea how to make traps, and I certainly wouldn't be able to kill anything with my bare hands. I finally located it, hidden under a pile of rubbish in their bedroom. I knew I had to hurry. I was afraid that my dad might actually use the thing on me if he found out I had taken it. Because I spent so much time in the woods, I had learned to be quiet while I was out there. The animals were skittish and any small noise would scare them away. Under normal circumstances, I would observe them. I liked to watch them in their habitat. This was the first time I'd ever given thought to kill one. It made me nervous and sad. It wasn't too long before a deer crept into my line of sight. I lay there for what felt like forever, eyes blurred with tears, and tried my hardest to pull the trigger. I tried to think of the fairies and their need for food. I imagined Faye with his gaunt face and joyless eyes. I still couldn't bring myself to do it. Thinking back now, I wouldn't have been able to kill the thing with the pistol anyway, even if I had managed a clean shot. At the time, I felt like a failure. I knew I couldn't kill anything, not even if it meant saving Faye and the others. I had started to make my way back home when I was struck with an idea. It was a deplorable idea, possibly the worst thought that had ever crossed my mind. Still, it seemed rational at the time. Instead of heading home, I made my way to the tree. The journey to the village seemed much shorter than it had before. I felt like I'd made it there in no time at all. I tapped as gently as I could on Faye's door, fearing that I would knock it off its minuscule hinges. I saw his face appear in the glass before the door popped open. "You came back sooner than expected. I just told my parents about you." There was a note of excitement in his little voice that made me feel guilty, but only for a moment. I haven't got anything to bring you, but I have an idea about what you guys could eat. 2 slightly larger fairies joined him at the door. They were staring at me with the same suspicion that Faye had before. I assumed they were his parents. I have something you could eat. It would mean you could get out into the sun for a little while. I may also be able to make a hole above your village, so the sun could shine in. You would take us with you? His father spoke then. Yes. Why, you have no reason to do that for us, his mother spoke up then, placing a small skeletal hand on his shoulder. I know what it feels like to be hungry, that it hurts. It's terrible. Plus, helping you could help me and my brother, too. By the time I got them back to my house, my parents had started to stir. They were still sprawled out on the couch, but they wouldn't be for long. I opened the top of the old bag I had placed them in and ushered them out onto the living room floor. You can eat those 2, but not the baby. I pointed to my brother, who was still fast asleep in his playpen. He's off limits. You would sacrifice your own people? Faye was staring at me quizzically. These aren't good giants. They're cruel and hateful. I was overcome with anger at the moment, remembering all the times my father had shoved that pistol in my face, all the times they had allowed me to go hungry so they could maintain their usage. I would gladly give them to you. What do you want in return? What do you mean? I hadn't expected to gain anything, so the question took me off guard. When you help our kind, you get a wish in return. We can grant you only one, so you have to make it count. Wishes cannot be reversed. He looked quite serious, but I knew what I wanted. I didn't even have to think about the wish before the words came spilling from my lips. I wish me and my brother could have good parents. The notion made me dizzy with anticipation. A mother who would love us. A father that would protect us. Bedtime stories and regular meals. No more fear of violence. No longer running in the woods to hide every evening. What I want more than anything is for us to have good parents. All right, Faye placed his tiny hand on mine. You will have good parents then. I watched as they ravaged them. My mother started to wake up as they devoured her, screaming as she tried to bat them away. By then there was really no use. Though they were small, their hunger was fierce. They had gouged crater-sized chunks from her legs and torso. I grabbed Dylan and waited on the porch then. I didn't want him to wake up and see what was happening. By the time they'd finished, the sun was high in the sky. They all appeared far better than they had before they'd eaten. Their bodies were no longer emaciated, and their eyes shone like gold in the sunlight. Their wings had taken on a dark hue. When the light touched them, they glinted with an array of colors. The deed is done. You can take us back to the hollow now. When you return, you will have a new family waiting for you. It was Faye's father that spoke. Just like that? It seemed too good to be true. Just like that. You have done us a great service. Our people will be full for a long time to come. We only ask that you leave the bag open on the walk back, so we can feel the sun a bit longer. I can do that. I smiled down at Faye as he nestled into the bag. You know, you guys could come out of the hollow every now and again. I'm in those woods all the time and haven't come across any other giants there. You would be safe. We may take you up on your offer, giant. My name is Amelia, so you know. You can stop calling me a giant. As promised, when I returned them to their hollow, I used a step stool from home and a shovel to make a small hole above their village. The light that broke through seemed otherworldly, Part of me wished that I could climb through and see what was on the other side, but I knew I had no business doing that. The hollow had given me more than enough magic to last a lifetime. I told them all goodbye and carried Dylan home then. I cried when we reached the house. Big, ugly, grateful sobs. It was completely transformed. There were no holes in the window. The garden out front was clean and filled with flowers. I could smell dinner wafting out of the screen door, and I saw my mother inside. She looked exactly like my mother, but healthy. Her hair was clean and her face was free of sores. She was cleaning and singing to herself. I was scooped up into the air by my father. I flinched for a moment before realizing that he, too, was a better version of himself. "Why are you crying, honey?" His voice was kind and soothing. "Did you fall down and hurt yourself or something?" "No, I'm okay. I'm happy is all." I hugged him so tight that he laughed and told me I was going to suffocate him. "You're filthy, darling. We gotta get you and Bub cleaned up for supper." He lifted Dylan from my arms and scooped me up into the air with his other hand. "Out of the way, love. I got 2 filthy varmints coming through," he called out to my mother, and she laughed as she swung the door open for us. The rest of my life has lived out like a dream. I visited the Fae a few times. His people did take me up on my offer. They ventured outside to gather seeds for crop and wrangled them some livestock. They also loved to bathe in the sun. It did wonders for their people. They began to fly again, and their eyes shimmered all the time. When I was 13, the tree disappeared. I don't know if it was because I didn't need them anymore, or because they didn't need me anymore. There are times that regret tries to sneak up on me. I feel remorse for the exchange I made. When that happens, I remember how happy my brother was growing up. He had been too small to question our parents' sudden change. All he knows are the better version. The feeling slips away then. My brother and I were far better after the exchange. Good riddance to bad rubbish, as my mother used to say. So quoth this raven. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.